Hello everyone, welcome to Midnight Story Channel. I'm here to help you today. I know many of you listen to these stories to help you drift off to sleep, and I'm honored to be part of your journey. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching now? Take a deep breath, get comfortable, and allow yourself to relax. Your story is about to begin. Story 1. The Starlight Motel's neon sign flickered weakly. Starlight blinking erratically against the oppressive velvet of the late-night sky. It was just past 11 p.m. when I pulled my rental car into the gravel lot. The sound of the tires crunching like broken bones in the pervasive silence. I hadn't planned on stopping here. A blown tire 100 miles back and a frustratingly closed repair shop had left me with few, if any, options. This run-down establishment, perched precariously on the outskirts of what looked like a forgotten desert town, was my only reprieve. The night clerk, a cadaverous figure with a sallow complexion and eyes that seemed permanently glazed over, barely looked up from his perpetually glowing smartphone as I approached the desk. His disinterest was palpable, a heavy weight in the stale, recycled air of the lobby. "Room for one?" I said, stifling a cavernous yawn that threatened to dislocate my jaw. "Just for the night." He grunted, a noncommittal sound, tapping at an ancient, beige computer that looked like it belonged in a museum. "Single or double?" "Single." "Fine." He slid a key across the counter, an actual heavy metal key, not a flimsy plastic key card, the brass dulled with the countless touch of anonymous hands. "Room 213. Up the stairs, end of the hall on the right." I nodded my thanks, the weight of my overnight bag suddenly feeling immeasurably heavier, imbued with an unseen burden. The stairwell reeked of stale cigarettes and a pungent, cloying mildew, a scent that clung to my clothes as I ascended. I tried, with limited success, not to touch the grimy, slick handrail. Room 213 was precisely where he'd said it would be, the peeling, faded gold numbers barely visible in the dim, flickering hallway light. The key, an unwilling participant, stuck in the lock for a moment, then turned with a reluctant, groaning protest. The room itself was precisely what I had braced myself for. A time capsule of outdated decor, a sagging mattress that seemed to embrace the very concept of a hollow, and a faint, indefinable odor I couldn't quite place, something subtly cloying and old. But it was, to my exhausted mind, clean enough, and at this point, the sheer weight of fatigue had rendered me largely indifferent to anything else. I dropped my bag with a thud and flopped onto the bed, not even bothering to kick off my shoes. I was just about to drift off into the merciful abyss of sleep when I heard it. A soft, muffled thump from the other side of the paper-thin wall. It was followed by what sounded distinctly like footsteps, faint at first, then growing more defined. My eyes snapped open, every nerve suddenly on high alert. The clerk hadn't mentioned any other guests, and the parking lot, as I recalled, had been eerily empty save for my own solitary car. Curious and a touch apprehensive, I pressed my ear against the cool, painted plaster of the wall. For a long, agonizing moment, there was nothing but the frantic beat of my own heart in my ears. Then, just as I was about to pull away, convinced it was my imagination playing tricks, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the room next door. I frowned. Perhaps someone had checked in while I was getting settled. A late arrival I hadn't seen, but something about the sound felt off. The footsteps were too even, too measured, too precise. Like whoever was making them was trying very, very hard to be quiet. A chill, cold and sharp, ran down my spine as another, far more sinister possibility occurred to me. What if someone had broken in? This certainly didn't seem like the kind of establishment that boasted top-notch security. I debated, for a fleeting moment, calling the front desk, but a quick mental image of the board, Utterly disengaged night clerk did little to inspire confidence in his ability to handle a potential intruder. Instead, I crept silently to my door and peered through the narrow peephole into the hallway. It was empty, silent. The door to the room next door, 215, was closed, a dark, featureless slab. No light visible underneath. I was about to retreat back into the perceived safety of my own room when I noticed something truly strange. There was a thick, undisturbed layer of dust on the doorknob of room 215, as if it hadn't been touched in months. My unease deepened, transforming into a cold, hard knot of fear. If no one had entered through that door, then how? A sudden sharp scratching sound from inside 215 made me jump, a strangled gasp catching in my throat. It was loud, frantic, like something was desperately trying to claw its way through the wall, through the very fabric of the building itself. My heart pounding, a frenzied drum against my ribs, I hurried back into my room, slamming the door shut and fumbling desperately with the lock. I grabbed my phone, intending to call the police, to scream for help, only to find the screen stubbornly displayed, no signal. Of course, I tried the ancient room phone, a beige relic of a bygone era, but it was dead, lifeless, emitting only a faint, high-pitched whine that set my teeth on edge when I held it to my ear. The scratching had stopped, replaced by an eerie, profound silence that was somehow infinitely worse. I stood there, frozen, straining my ears for any sound, any indication of what was happening beyond the wall. Then I heard the whispers. They were faint at first, barely audible, like dry leaves skittering across a vast, empty plain. But as I listened, straining every fiber of my being, they grew louder, more distinct, coalescing into something undeniable. It wasn't English, or any language I recognized. The voices, and there were definitely multiple voices, spoke in harsh, guttural tones that made my skin crawl, made my very bones ache with an unseen pressure. I backed away from the wall, my mind racing, a kaleidoscope of impossible, terrifying scenarios. This couldn't be happening. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe it was the television in another room turned up too loud, distorted by the poor insulation. Or perhaps my exhaustion, coupled with the bizarre solitude, was simply making my mind play cruel tricks. My thoughts were violently interrupted by a loud, jarring bang, like something impossibly heavy had been thrown with immense force against the wall. I stifled a scream, biting down on my knuckles, my eyes darting wildly around the room, searching desperately for a weapon. Anything. A lamp, a chair, anything I could use to defend myself against the unseen horror beyond the wall. That's when I saw it. In the corner of the room, partially hidden by the bulky dresser, was a door. An adjoining door, to room 215. My blood ran cold, a sudden, horrifying realization. I hadn't noticed it earlier, its presence so subtly, unnervingly camouflaged against the drab wallpaper. But now, in the flickering, uncertain light of my phone, it seemed to dominate the room, its presence malevolent and undeniably threatening. As if sensing my horrified gaze, the whispers suddenly stopped. The profound, suffocating silence that followed was deafening, charged with a terrible, agonizing anticipation. Then, slowly, agonizingly slowly, the handle of the adjoining door began to turn. I didn't think. I just reacted. A primal, animalistic instinct for survival seized me. I grabbed my bag, a frantic blur of motion, my hands fumbling desperately with the main door's lock, my fingers numb with panic. I could hear something now on the other side of the adjoining door. A wet, slithering sound, a sickening, squelching noise that defied all rational explanation, a sound that could not exist. Finally, the lock gave way with a resounding click, and I burst into the hallway. Not daring to look back, not daring to confirm the unspeakable horror that lurked just inches behind me. I sprinted for the stairs, taking them two at a time, my legs pumping, my breath ragged, nearly falling in my frantic haste. The night clerk, jolted from his phone-induced stupor, looked up in alarm as I crashed into the lobby, a wild-eyed, disheveled apparition. What the? There's someone in room 215. I gasped, struggling to catch my breath, my lungs burning, raw, or something. I heard. He cut me off, his sallow face paling, his eyes widening with a sudden, dawning comprehension. That's not possible, he said, his voice a low, horrified whisper. Room 215 has been sealed off for years. Not since the incident. What incident? I demanded, my voice raw with terror and desperate curiosity. But he was already reaching for the antique rotary phone on the counter, his fingers trembling. You need to leave, he said, his voice shaking now, betraying the last vestiges of his earlier indifference. I'm calling the owner. He'll know what to do. I didn't need to be told twice. I ran to my car, my hands shaking so violently I could barely get the key into the ignition. As I peeled out of the parking lot, tires spitting gravel, I glanced in my rearview mirror. A figure stood in the window of room 215, barely visible in the gloom, a dark, indistinct silhouette against the deeper blackness inside. But what I could discern, even from that distance, made my blood run cold. It wasn't human, not even close. I drove through the night, putting as much distance as I possibly could between myself and the Starlight Motel. When the sun finally rose, painting the eastern sky in soft, reassuring pastels, I pulled into a rest stop, exhausted but too wired to sleep. Curiosity, a powerful and dangerous force, got the better of me. I pulled out my phone and, now that I had a signal, searched online for any information about the motel. Most of the results were just bland booking sites and anonymous reviews. But buried on the third page of results, tucked away in the forgotten corners of the internet, I found something that made my heart stop. It was an old news article, yellowed with age, dated over a decade ago. The headline screamed, "Tragic fire at Starlight Motel claims lives, room sealed OFF." According to the faded article, a fire had broken out in room 215, tragically killing a family of 4. The cause was never definitively determined, but witnesses reported strange, inhuman noises and unearthly screams coming from the room just before the blaze started. The room, the article concluded, had been sealed off shortly after the incident, following multiple reports of unexplained phenomena from guests staying in the vicinity. The motel owner was quoted as saying they planned to eventually demolish that entire section of the building. Clearly, that had never happened. I sat there, staring at my phone screen as the horrifying implications slowly, relentlessly sank in. Whatever had been in that room wasn't human. It never had been. And it was still there, waiting. I've never gone back to that town. And I've never stayed in another motel since that night. But sometimes, in the deep, suffocating dark of night, I still hear those whispers, faint and insidious, echoing in the quiet spaces of my mind. And I wonder what would have happened if that adjoining door had opened just a few seconds sooner. Because now I know that there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that lurk just on the other side of reality, patiently, hungrily waiting. And sometimes, all that separates us from them is a thin motel wall and a door that should never, ever be opened. Story 2. The moment I first heard that faint, unidentifiable murmur from the supposedly vacant apartment next door, a cold knot of dread began to form in my stomach. It was a Tuesday evening, 2 weeks after I'd moved into Oak Grove Apartments. And I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that this wasn't going to be an ordinary night. But I never, in my wildest nightmares, could have imagined the chilling secrets those paper-thin walls were hiding, or how perilously close I would come to being consumed by a conspiracy that lurked, smiling and waving, behind the facade of suburban normalcy. My new apartment, once a beacon of hope and quiet solitude, had become a trap, and I, unwittingly, was the prey. It all started innocently enough. After years of enduring the cramped, sunless confines of a studio apartment downtown, I had finally, painstakingly, saved enough for a decent place. A proper sanctuary nestled in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood on the tranquil outskirts of the sprawling city. Oak Grove Apartments. The glossy brochure had boasted promised spacious units, a sparkling community pool, and, most invitingly, friendly neighbors. It had seemed, to my weary soul, utterly perfect. The day I moved in, a balmy spring Saturday, I was greeted by Sarah. She lived directly across the hall. A petite woman in her mid-30s with a warm, almost effusive smile and a cascade of sun-kissed blonde hair. She held out a plate of freshly baked, still warm chocolate chip cookies, their aroma filling the hallway with a comforting sweetness. "Welcome to Oak Grove," she chirped, her voice bright and melodic. "You're going to absolutely love it here. We're all like family." I thanked her, genuinely touched by the unexpected gesture, a wave of warmth washing over me. As I unpacked that evening, the muffled sounds of life around me, a television next door, the distant, joyful laughter of children somewhere down the hall, felt cozy, lived in, reassuring. I went to bed that night, a profound sense of peace settling over me, convinced I'd made the absolute right choice. The first week passed in a blur of settling in, unpacking the last few boxes, and establishing the new, quiet rhythm of my work-from-home routine. I didn't see much of my neighbors, just the occasional nod or polite hello in the hallway, fleeting encounters that seemed perfectly normal. But a subtle, almost imperceptible detail began to prick at my awareness. They always seemed to be watching me. Not openly, not in a way that screamed suspicion, but I'd catch glimpses of curtains twitching shut just as I walked by. Feel unseen eyes on me as I checked my mail, a prickle of unease on my skin. I brushed it off, a casual dismissal. Just my imagination, I told myself. They were probably just curious about the new guy. A new face in a tight-knit community. Nothing more. It was on that Tuesday evening, about 2 weeks after I'd moved in, that things started to feel undeniably off. I was taking out the trash, the mundane ritual a brief escape from my desk, when I inadvertently overheard a hushed conversation between two of my neighbors in the stairwell. They fell silent the instant they saw me, their faces snapping away, exchanging a quick, loaded look I couldn't quite interpret. "Evening," I said, forcing a casual smile, trying to break the sudden, thick awkwardness. They mumbled something incoherent, a noncommittal humph and a hasty hello before hurrying past me, practically jogging down the stairs. As I continued my descent, a chilling whisper, faint but distinct, drifted back to me. "Do you think he knows?" "Knows what?" The question gnawed at me, a persistent, irritating burr under my skin. As I went about my evening routine, I tried to shake it off, to dismiss it as a meaningless fragment of overheard chatter, but a tiny seed of unease had been planted, a cold, foreign body growing in the warmth of my newfound peace. The next day, the subtle shifts intensified. I noticed more whispers, more furtive glances. In the communal laundry room, conversations would abruptly cease the moment I entered, only to resume in hushed tones when I'd left. In the elevator, people would stand unusually far from me, pressing themselves against the walls, stealing quick, almost terrified glances when they thought I wasn't looking directly at them. By the end of the week, the entire atmosphere in the building had shifted dramatically. The initial friendly smiles were gone, replaced by tight-lipped nods and averted gazes, eyes that darted away as if caught doing something illicit. Even Sarah, who had been so welcoming, so effusively friendly at first, now scurried into her apartment whenever she saw me coming, her head down, her previous warmth replaced by a palpable distance. I started spending more and more time confined within the walls of my own apartment, feeling increasingly isolated, increasingly paranoid. Was I imagining things? Was I, perhaps, unknowingly doing something to offend everyone, some social faux pas I wasn't even aware of? One particularly restless night, unable to sleep, haunted by the oppressive silence, I heard voices in the hallway. Curiosity, a powerful and dangerous force, finally got the better of me. I crept silently to my door, pressing my ear against the cool wood. Can't wait much longer. A man's voice, low and urgent, was saying, "He's not like the others. We need to act soon." "Patience," another voice replied, calm and resonant. I recognized it. It was Mr. Grayson, the elderly, seemingly gentle man from the first floor, often seen tending to his small potted plants in the lobby. "Everything is proceeding according to plan. He'll be ready soon enough." Ready for what? My heart was pounding so loudly in my chest. A frantic drum. I was sure they must be able to hear it through the thin door. I held my breath, straining every nerve to catch more of the conversation. But they had moved on, their voices fading into indistinct murmurs as they walked further down the hallway. I barely slept that night, my mind racing, a frantic kaleidoscope of possibilities, each more outlandish and terrifying than the last. Was this some kind of cult? A hidden criminal organization operating out of a seemingly normal apartment building? Or was I simply, definitively, losing my mind? The next morning, determined to find answers, I decided to do some digging. I started with a simple internet search, Oak Grove Apartments. The results were surprisingly sparse. Just a bare-bones website with generic rental information and a few suspiciously positive generic reviews. No social media presence. No news articles, not even local ones. It was as if the place barely existed online, a phantom address in the digital realm. Digging deeper, I tried searching for information on my neighbors, but it was like they were ghosts. No social media profiles, no public records I could find. Even Sarah, who had mentioned working as a teacher, didn't show up in any local school district employee listings. My unease was growing by the hour, a cold, creeping certainty. I knew instinctively that I should probably just leave, cut my losses, find another place to live anywhere else. But something held me there. A morbid curiosity, a desperate, gnawing need to understand what was truly going on. I started keeping a detailed log of everything I observed. The whispered conversations, the strange comings and goings at odd, late hours, the way certain apartments always had their curtains drawn, windows perpetually dark. I noted which neighbors seemed to be in charge, who deferred to whom, who held a quiet authority. One name, in particular, kept coming up, a whispered refrain, Anderson. I'd never met anyone in the building by that name, but I'd overheard it multiple times, always spoken with a chilling mix of reverence and undeniable fear. About a month after I'd moved in, the unsettling atmosphere reached a terrifying crescendo. I was returning from a late-night grocery run, my arms laden with bags, when I saw them. A group of my neighbors, huddled in the dimly lit lobby, their faces grim, expectant. They fell silent the instant I entered, all eyes turning to me, a sudden, collective weight. Mr. Grayson, his usually kindly face now stern and forbidding, stepped forward. "It's time we had a talk, young man." My heart began to race, a frantic drum against my ribs. But I forced myself to stay outwardly calm, to project an air of normalcy I didn't feel. "About what?" "About your place here," Sarah chimed in, her once friendly voice now strangely cold, devoid of all warmth. "About what's expected of you." I looked around the lobby, taking in the grim, unyielding faces of my neighbors. There were at least a dozen of them, forming a silent, impenetrable wall, blocking the way to the stairs and the elevator. I was trapped. "I don't understand," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady, to quell the tremor that threatened to betray my fear. "What's going on here?" Mr. Grayson sighed, a sound of profound, weary disappointment. "We had such high hopes for you, Marcus. We thought you might be compatible, but your resistance, your questioning, it's clear you're not ready." "Ready for what?" I demanded, a surge of anger finally overriding my fear. What is this place? Who are you people? A tall man, one I'd never seen before, stepped out of the deepest shadows of the lobby. He moved with a quiet, undeniable authority, and the others seemed to subtly defer to his presence, their gazes dropping. "I'm Anderson," he said, his voice deep and resonant, a chilling calm in its timbre. "And this is so much more than just an apartment building." He gestured around him, a slow, sweeping motion of his hand, and I noticed, for the first time, that the lobby seemed subtly different. The walls seemed to shimmer, the edges of reality blurring, the very air vibrating with an unseen energy. "We are the Guardians," Anderson continued, his voice resonating with an ancient power. "Protectors of a threshold between worlds, and we had hoped you might join us." My mind reeled, struggling desperately to process what I was hearing. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of elaborate, sick prank. A shared delusion. A mass psychosis. "You're insane," I said, backing slowly towards the front door, my hand reaching behind me, blindly searching for the cold comfort of the handle. "All of you." Sarah stepped forward, her eyes pleading, a flash of what might have been genuine concern in their depths. "Please, Marcus, just listen. We've been watching you, evaluating you. You have potential, abilities you haven't even begun to tap into. We can help you understand, help you become something greater." I shook my head, frantically fumbling for the door handle behind me, my fingers numb. "I don't want any part of this. I'm leaving now." Anderson's face hardened, the last vestige of polite civility vanishing, replaced by a cold, unwavering resolve. "I'm afraid that's not an option. You know too much now. If you won't join us willingly, we'll have to take other measures." As he spoke, the air around him seemed to ripple and distort, like heat haze over a desert road. The other neighbors began to change too, their forms subtly, horrifyingly shifting in ways that defied all human anatomy. I caught fleeting glimpses of things that shouldn't exist. Extra limbs, eyes where there shouldn't be eyes. Skin that moved and flowed like viscous liquid, revealing glimpses of unimaginable, iridescent colors. Terror, pure and unadulterated, gripped me. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. With a strangled cry, a desperate sound torn from my throat, I wrenched the door open and ran. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, my lungs burning, my legs shaking uncontrollably. As I peeled out of the parking lot, tires screaming on the asphalt, I glanced wildly in my rearview mirror. The entire building seemed to be wavering, shimmering like a mirage in the desert heat. And in every single window, faces watched me go. Faces that were no longer entirely human. I drove through the night, putting as many miles as humanly possible between myself and Oak Grove. When the sun finally rose, a pale, hesitant light, I found myself in a small, anonymous town I didn't recognize, my gas tank nearly empty. As I sit here now in this dingy, anonymous motel room, trying desperately to make sense of what happened, I can't shake the chilling feeling that it's not over. That they're still out there, watching, waiting. I don't know what they are, or what they truly wanted from me, but I know with absolute certainty that I can never go back. And I know that I'll never look at my neighbors the same way again, because now I understand. Now I know that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones hiding in plain sight, behind the smiling doors of ordinary apartments, wearing the benign faces of seemingly normal people. And I'll always wonder how many other buildings out there are more than they appear. How thin, truly, is the veil between our world and whatever lies beyond? I don't have any answers. But I know one thing for certain, I'll never feel truly safe in my own home again. Story 3. I never imagined my peaceful solo trek would morph into a desperate dash for survival through the dense, whispering forests of the Pacific Northwest. But then again, I also never thought I'd stumble upon a sprawling, illicit marijuana operation. It's truly remarkable how swiftly a serene morning hike can plummet into a full-blown nightmare. That fateful day dawned like any other during my week-long solitary expedition. The initial shafts of sunlight pierced the leafy canopy, painting shifting patterns on my tent. The air was sharp and clean, redolent with the scent of pine and damp earth. I stretched, feeling the gratifying clicks and pops of my joints after a night spent on the unyielding ground. A quick breakfast of granola and dried fruit fueled me, and soon I had my gear packed. Hitting the winding trail, the path meandered deeper into the woods, occasionally opening up to reveal breathtaking panoramas of the jagged mountains beyond. I took my sweet time, frequently pausing to marvel at clusters of wildflowers, or to simply listen to the vibrant chorus of birdsong echoing through the trees. Around the midpoint of the day, an adventurous impulse seized me, and I decided to diverge from the main trail. Whispers of a stunning, hidden cascade had reached my ears, and my spirit of discovery got the better of my caution. I unfurled my map and consulted my compass, carefully charting a course through the trackless wilderness. The going was rough, the undergrowth was thick and unforgiving, forcing me to push through thorny brambles and low-hanging branches. Beads of sweat trickled down my forehead and my shirt clung uncomfortably to my back. But the allure of uncovering something new spurred me onward. After perhaps an hour of strenuous bushwhacking, a peculiar anomaly caught my attention. The forest ahead seemed to shift. The trees were notably more spread out, and the dense underbrush had been conspicuously cleared away. Intrigued, I pressed on. That's when my world tilted. My heart nearly seized in my chest. Before me stretched endless rows of marijuana plants, their distinctive leaves utterly unmistakable. These plants were tall, meticulously cared for, and shockingly abundant. This was no small-time operation. This was a formidable enterprise. I froze, suddenly acutely aware of my exposed position. Every rational instinct screamed at me to retreat, to quietly retrace my steps as if I'd never laid eyes on this illicit scene. But a morbid fascination, coupled with pure shock, held me captive for a few critical moments. My gaze darted around the clearing, absorbing details I desperately wished I could unsee: irrigation lines snaking between the rows, a couple of small sheds nestled at the far end of the field. And then, the worst of it, a pair of men moving deliberately between the plants, inspecting their crop. One of them looked up. Our eyes locked across the sprawling field, and time seemed to stretch, then shatter. I witnessed the surprise on his face contort almost instantly into a mask of rage. He bellowed something to his companion and began to charge towards me. It was in that searing moment that my primal survival instinct finally roared to life. I spun around and ran, branches lashing at my face as I tore through the underbrush, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Shouts echoed behind me, growing chillingly closer with every desperate stride. These men, I realized with a fresh surge of terror, knew this terrain far better than I did. I ran blindly, abandoning all thought of direction or stealth. My singular, overriding goal was to put as much distance as humanly possible between myself and that clearing. My lungs screamed and my legs burned with an agonizing ache, yet sheer terror propelled me forward. A gunshot ripped through the air, the sound reverberating sharply through the trees. I ducked instinctively, nearly losing my footing on the treacherous, uneven ground. They were shooting at me. This was real. This was happening. I spotted a massive fallen tree ahead and dove behind its protective bulk, desperately trying to snatch a breath and formulate a plan. I couldn't outrun them indefinitely. Footsteps crunched ominously on fallen leaves nearby. I held my breath, pressing myself flat against the damp earth. A voice called out, "Far too close for comfort. We know you're out there. Come out now, and we won't hurt you." I almost laughed, a hollow, bitter sound at the blatant lie they had just shot at me. There was no way I was surrendering. Another voice, quieter but still audible, added, "If he makes it to the main trail, he won't." The first voice growled in agreement. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to conjure the map in my mind. If I could reach the main trail, there might be other hikers, safety in numbers. But in which direction was it? The voices seemed to be moving away. Just slightly. It was now or never. I took a deep, shuddering breath, chose a direction that felt right, and ran. I moved as quickly and as quietly as my panic state allowed, which wasn't very quiet at all. Every snapping twig sounded like a gunshot in my ears, and I braced myself for the impact of a bullet in my back at any second. Then, the comforting sound of rushing water reached me, the creek. If I could reach it, I could use it to throw them off my trail. Hope, like a jolt of adrenaline, gave me a second wind, and I veered sharply towards the sound. I burst through the tree line and saw the creek below, swollen from recent rains. Without a moment's hesitation, I half ran, half slid down the steep bank and plunged into the icy water. The shocking cold stole my breath away. The current was far stronger than I'd anticipated, tugging fiercely at my legs as I waded across. By the time I reached the opposite bank, I was drenched and shivering uncontrollably, but a flicker of optimism about my chances ignited within me. I clambered up the steep bank, my soaked clothes heavy and clinging, as I pulled myself over the edge. A hand clamped down on my arm. I screamed in pure terror, struggling fiercely to pull away, but the grip was like iron. I looked up into the grim face of a man I hadn't seen before. He must have circled around while his comrades chased me. "Gotcha," he snarled, yanking me roughly to my feet. I didn't think. I just reacted. My free hand shot out, catching him squarely in the nose. There was a satisfying crunch, and he let go, howling in a mix of pain and surprise. I shoved him with all my might, and he stumbled backward, his foot snagging on a root. He went down hard, his head cracking against a rock with a sickening thud. He lay utterly still for a moment. I just stood there, panting, staring at his motionless form. Was he dead? Had I killed him? The thought sent a wave of nausea through me. Shouts in the distance abruptly jolted me back to the grim reality. I couldn't stay here. I took off running again, my wet boots squelching with every desperate step. The trees began to thin out, and then suddenly, miraculously, I burst out onto a wide, well-maintained trail, the main hiking path. I could have wept with sheer relief. I turned left, moving as fast as my utterly exhausted legs would carry me. I had to find other people, or the ranger station, or anything that resembled civilization. After what felt like an eternity, but was likely only 20 minutes, I heard voices ahead, normal voices, laughing. I rounded a bend and saw a group of day hikers approaching me. They took one look at my bedraggled appearance, soaking wet, caked in mud and scratches. My eyes wide with panic and stopped dead in their tracks. "Are you okay?" a woman asked, concern etched clearly in her voice. The adrenaline that had been my sole fuel suddenly evaporated. My legs gave out beneath me and I sank to the ground, shaking uncontrollably. Call the Rangers," I managed to gasp out. "There are men back there, guns." The group sprang into action. One man immediately pulled out a satellite phone and began dialing, while others gathered around me, offering water and a warm jacket. As I sat there, waiting for help to arrive, the full, crushing weight of what had transpired began to sink in. I had stumbled upon something I was never meant to see. I had run for my life, been shot at, and quite possibly seriously injured or even killed a man. I closed my eyes, the harrowing events replaying vividly in my mind. The serene beauty of the forest just that morning felt like a distant, impossible dream. How quickly everything had changed. How agonizingly close I had come to never making it out of those dark woods. When the Rangers finally pulled up, I recounted every detail. Their faces grew grim as they took notes and called for backup. As they helped me into their truck to take me to safety, one of them gently patted my shoulder. "You're lucky to be alive, son," he said solemnly. "We've been trying to locate this operation for months. You've helped us more than you know." I nodded numbly, feeling neither particularly lucky nor helpful at that moment. As we drove away, I glanced back at the forest. From here, it appeared tranquil, even inviting. But I knew better now. I knew the hidden dangers that could lurk behind that verdant curtain. I had set out that morning seeking adventure, a profound connection with nature. Instead, I had uncovered the darkest side of humanity, concealed deep within one of the most breathtaking places I had ever witnessed. As the trees receded in the distance, I made a silent vow to myself. I would return to the wilderness one day. I wouldn't allow this harrowing experience to rob me of my deep love for nature and exploration. But next time, I would be wiser, far more cautious, and I would certainly stick to the marked trails. Story 4. The moment I realized my campsite had been tampered with, a chill snaked down my spine that had nothing to do with the crisp, cool mountain air. Little did I know, that was merely the prelude to what would become the longest, most terrifying night of my life. I had eagerly anticipated this solo camping excursion for months. The relentless grind of city life, with its ceaseless cacophony and unending stream of faces, had been steadily wearing me down. I yearned for an escape, an opportunity to reconnect with the raw beauty of nature and, more crucially, with my own inner peace. The initial 2 days unfolded exactly as I had envisioned. I discovered an idyllic spot beside a murmuring brook, sufficiently secluded from the main trails that I hadn't encountered another soul since my arrival. The air was sharp and pure, infused with the invigorating scent of pine and wild blossoms. At night, the sky transformed into a velvet blanket emblazoned with a breathtaking tapestry of stars, utterly unobscured by the city's artificial glow. I felt a profound sense of tranquility, a peace I hadn't known in ages. On the third morning, I awoke to the cheerful symphony of birdsong. I stretched, feeling the satisfying symphony of pops and clicks in my joints after a night spent on the firm ground. The thin nylon of my tent was bathed in the soft, diffused light of dawn, and a smile touched my lips as I anticipated another day filled with invigorating hikes and blissful solitude. That's when a subtle dissonance caught my attention. The zipper of my tent was partially open. A frown creased my brow. I was certain I had meticulously closed it the night before. A swift scan of my small tent revealed nothing overtly amiss. Yet an unsettling sensation began to coil in the pit of my stomach. I eased myself out of my sleeping bag and reached for my backpack, intending to retrieve my toiletries for a refreshing morning wash in the stream. As my fingers rummaged through the bag, the disquiet grew. Things weren't where I had meticulously left them. My clothes were jumbled, my food stores disarrayed. With a mounting sense of dread, I searched frantically for the small, waterproof pouch where I safeguarded my most vital possessions. It wasn't in its customary place. In a surge of frantic energy, I appended the entire contents of my backpack onto the tent floor. The pouch was nowhere to be found. My hands trembled as I ran them through my tangled hair. The pouch contained my identification, my credit cards, and my phone, my sole lifeline to the outside world. It was gone. I crawled out of the tent, my eyes sweeping across the campsite. Perhaps I had taken the pouch out last night and simply forgotten to put it back? But deep down, a cold certainty told me that wasn't the case. I was always meticulously careful with my valuables, especially out here in the vast wilderness. At first glance, the campsite appeared undisturbed. My small cooking set still hung from a tree branch, my water bottles neatly aligned by the fire pit. But then I saw it, a distinct set of footprints in the soft earth near my tent. Far too large to be my own. Someone had been here. Someone had rifled through my belongings while I slept. The realization struck me like a physical blow. I wasn't as alone out here as I had deluded myself into believing. The profound sense of peace and safety I had felt just moments before shattered, replaced by a burgeoning, suffocating panic. I spent the next few hours desperately scouring the campsite for the missing pouch, clinging to a desperate, fleeting hope that it had simply been misplaced. But as the sun climbed higher in the sky, I was forced to confront the grim truth. It was gone, along with my only means of communication and identification. I sank down by the cold, dead fire pit, attempting to think rationally through the thick fog of fear that enveloped me. I had enough food and water to sustain myself for a few more days. I knew roughly which direction would lead me back to civilization even without my map. I could hike out and find help, but the mere thought of spending another night in this very spot, knowing that someone had already violated the sanctity of my campsite, made my skin crawl. I made a resolute decision. I would pack up and begin hiking out immediately. I could cover a significant distance before the cloak of night descended, as I was meticulously stuffing my sleeping bag into its compression sack. A twig snapped sharply in the woods directly behind me. I whirled around, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The forest appeared unchanged, the sunlight still dappling the leaves, a gentle breeze still rustling the branches. But now it felt oppressive, heavy with unseen, lurking threats. "Hello," I called out, hating how small and tremulous my voice sounded in the vastness. There was no reply, only the normal, innocuous sounds of the forest. I turned back to my packing, my movements now hurried and clumsy, every rustle of leaves causing me to flinch. Twice more. I could have sworn I heard distinct footsteps, but each time I looked, there was nothing there. By the time I had everything packed, my nerves were utterly frayed. I shouldered my backpack, took one last, lingering look at the campsite that had been my peaceful haven just hours before, and set off down the trail. The hike was grueling. Every elongated shadow seemed to shift and writhe. Every subtle sound a potential, lurking threat. The oppressive weight of my pack, combined with the relentless stress of the situation, swiftly drained my energy. Yet I pushed on, desperate to put as much distance as humanly possible between myself and that violated campsite. As the afternoon waned, doubt began to insidiously creep in. Was I even heading in the correct direction? Without my map or phone, I was relying solely on my faltering memory and an increasingly unreliable sense of direction. The endless expanse of trees all began to merge into an indistinguishable blur, the faint path becoming less and less distinct. The sun was already dipping below the horizon by the time I had to agonizingly admit the truth. I was lost. The faint trail I had been following simply petered out into nothingness, leaving me stranded in a small, isolated clearing as the shadows lengthened menacingly around me. I was utterly exhausted, consumed by fear, and completely disoriented. I had no recourse but to make camp for the night. With trembling hands, I hastily set up my tent, no longer caring about finding the perfect spot. I didn't even bother with a fire, desperate not to draw any unwanted attention to myself. As complete darkness descended, I crawled into my tent and zipped it shut with painstaking care. Sleep was an impossible luxury. Every single sound from the surrounding forest seemed brutally amplified. The mournful hoot of an owl made me gasp aloud. The scurrying of some tiny animal nearby sent me bolt upright. I clutched my small camping knife, the only semblance of protection I possessed, and desperately tried to regulate my ragged breathing. It must have been nearing midnight when I finally heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, circling my tent. I froze, not daring to even breathe. The footsteps paused, then resumed, this time even closer. A chilling shadow fell across the tent wall. My heart was pounding so violently, I was certain it must be audible to anyone within 100 feet. I wanted to scream, to bolt, to do something, anything, but sheer terror held me utterly paralyzed. A hand brushed tentatively against the tent, tracing a slow line down the nylon fabric. I bit my lip so hard I tasted blood, desperate to suppress a whimpering sound. "I know you're in there," a voice rasped, low and gravelly. "Why don't you come on out? We need to have a little chat." I remained utterly silent, my mind racing in a frantic search for answers. Who was this person? What could they possibly want? The zipper of my tent began to move, slowly, agonizingly, inching upward. I gripped my small knife tighter, knowing full well it would offer little to no defense against whoever was lurking out there. But it was all I had. Just as the zipper reached the halfway point, a new sound pierced the oppressive night, voices, distant but unmistakably drawing closer. Flashlight beams danced erratically through the trees. The hand on my tent instantly withdrew as if burned. I heard a muffled curse, then the distinct sound of someone crashing away through the dense underbrush. "Hello," a new voice called out, firm and reassuring. "Forest Service. Is anyone there?" Relief, so potent it left me lightheaded, flooded through me. I scrambled frantically out of the tent. "Here!" I shouted, my voice cracking with emotion. "I'm here!" Two rangers emerged into the small clearing, their powerful flashlights momentarily blinding after the profound darkness. They looked from my disheveled, panic-stricken appearance to my hastily erected tent with expressions of genuine concern. "Are you all right, miss?" one asked, his voice kind. The entire harrowing story came pouring out of me then. The missing pouch, the chilling footsteps, the terrifying encounter just moments before. The rangers listened gravely, exchanging meaningful glances. "You're not the first," the older ranger said, his voice serious when I had finally finished. "We've had reports of someone stalking campers in this area. That's why we're out here tonight. You're lucky we came along when we did." Lucky. The word felt woefully inadequate to describe the overwhelming mix of terror and relief that consumed me. The rangers gently escorted me back to their station, where I gave a formal statement. They arranged for a ride back to the city for me the following day, after I'd had a chance to rest in the relative safety of the station. As I lay on the small cot they provided, finally feeling secure enough to allow sleep to claim me, I couldn't help but reflect on how swiftly everything had changed. In the span of a single day, the forest had transformed from a peaceful sanctuary into a place of profound terror. I knew it would be a very long time before I felt comfortable camping again, if ever. The chilling memory of those footsteps, that low voice in the darkness, would forever linger with me. But I was alive. I had survived. And as the first faint light of dawn began to filter through the station windows, I made a silent, steadfast promise to myself. I wouldn't allow this harrowing experience to defeat me. One day, I would return to the wilderness, but next time I wouldn't be alone. Story 5. The moment I spotted the armed figures through the telephoto lens of my camera, a cold dread seized me. What I didn't know was how swiftly my peaceful wildlife expedition would transform into a desperate, harrowing fight for survival. I've always harbored an intense passion for wildlife photography. There's something utterly magical about capturing the raw, untamed beauty of nature, freezing fleeting moments that most people will never have the privilege to witness. That fervent passion is precisely what drew me to this remote, unforgiving corner of the Alaskan wilderness, hundreds of miles from the nearest town, and even further from anything resembling civilization. I'd been out here for nearly 2 weeks, my tent a temporary, fragile home nestled amidst the towering pines and rugged, snow-dusted landscape. The solitude was a profound bliss, broken only by the occasional cry of a raven or the subtle rustle of a small animal moving through the undergrowth. Each dawn, I would awaken with the first hint of sun, eager to discover what new wonders I might capture through my lens. On this particular morning, I ventured out just as the first delicate rays of sunlight were painting the vast sky in ethereal hues of pink and gold. I had a specific destination in mind, a small, secluded clearing where I had strategically placed some trail cameras a few days prior. My hope was to snag some compelling shots of the local wolf pack, which I knew frequented this very area. The hike was invigorating, the crisp morning air filling my lungs with each steady breath as I carefully navigated the faint, almost invisible trail. The familiar, comforting weight of my camera gear settled securely on my back. As I drew nearer to the clearing, I instinctively slowed my pace, moving as quietly as a shadow to avoid startling any potential wildlife. I reached the very edge of the clearing and crouched low, meticulously surveying the area before daring to step into the open. That's when I saw them, 3 men, clad in camouflage, each carrying high-powered rifles. They were clustered around something on the ground, something large and undeniably still. My breath hitched in my throat as the horrifying realization dawned. It wasn't a deer. They were standing over a bear, a massive grizzly, its magnificent, shaggy coat now tragically stained crimson. These weren't hunters. This was poaching, blatant and unforgivable. Without a second thought, driven by a surge of pure instinct, I raised my camera and began to furiously snap photos. The telephoto lens brought the grim scene into razor-sharp focus. The men's faces, the menacing glint of their guns, the tragically still form of the dead bear, undeniable evidence. My heart was pounding a furious rhythm against my ribs, yet my hand remained miraculously steady, years of practice taking over. I was so utterly consumed by the act of capturing the scene, meticulously framing each shot, that I failed to notice one of the men look up. I missed the subtle nudge he gave his companions, the pointed finger in my direction. It wasn't until I heard the sharp, guttural shout that the full, horrifying weight of my mistake crashed down on me. "Hey, you there!" I instinctively dropped to the ground, but it was already too late. They had seen me. Panic surged through me, a cold wave of terror, as I heard them begin to move, their footsteps heavy and purposeful in my direction. I scrambled backward, staying low to the ground, then spun and ran. The forest that had seemed so tranquil just moments before now felt suffocating, a labyrinth of oppressive obstacles designed to trip me up. Branches whipped violently at my face as I crashed through the dense underbrush, the relentless sound of their pursuit behind me spurring me on. I ran blindly, without direction, my singular thought to put as much distance as humanly possible between myself and those ruthless poachers. My lungs burned with a searing agony, and my legs ached with a deep, punishing fatigue. But sheer fear propelled me forward. I could hear them shouting to each other, their voices chillingly close for comfort. After what felt like an eternity, but was likely only a few minutes, I burst out of the dense trees onto a rocky, exposed slope. I paused for a precious moment, gasping for air, desperately trying to get my bearings. That's when the gunshot cracked, a sharp, terrifying report that echoed violently through the valley, followed by the unnerving whine of a bullet whistling far, far too close. They were shooting at me. This wasn't about scaring me off anymore. They intended to silence me permanently. I dove behind a large, jagged boulder, my heart hammering so fiercely I thought it might rupture from my chest. What in the world had I stumbled into? I was no action hero, just a wildlife photographer who had unwittingly walked into something far grander and infinitely more dangerous than I could have ever conceived. Another shot rang out, sending chips of rock exploding from the boulder barely inches from my head. I needed to move. I needed to find better cover. My eyes darted frantically around, searching for any conceivable escape route. The slope continued its upward climb, becoming increasingly steep and treacherously rocky. It would be difficult terrain, agonizing to ascend, but it might just be enough to slow my relentless pursuers down. Taking a deep, ragged breath, I sprinted from behind the boulder, zigzagging erratically as I scrambled upward. More shots followed, but the uneven, unpredictable ground seemed to throw off their aim. I didn't dare look back, focusing every ounce of my dwindling energy on the arduous climb. I finally reached a small, precarious ledge and allowed myself a moment's fleeting rest, pressing myself flat against the cold rock face. The shouts of the men were more distant now, but still far too close for any semblance of comfort. I knew with a chilling certainty that I couldn't maintain this punishing pace for long. I needed a plan. That's when a flicker of hope ignited. My satellite phone, safely tucked away in my backpack. If I could just snatch a moment, a precious few seconds, to make a call, to alert the authorities. But first, I needed to find a truly safe spot. I continued my climb, moving as swiftly and silently as my exhausted body would allow. The terrain became increasingly treacherous, demanding every ounce of my concentration to navigate safely. The menacing voices of my pursuers gradually faded, replaced only by the ragged sound of my own labored breathing and the thunderous pounding of my heart. Finally, I reached a small, cave-like opening carved into the rock face. It wasn't deep, but it offered precious shelter and a chance to finally catch my breath. I squeezed inside, wincing as my camera bag scraped painfully against the rough rock. I'd completely forgotten I was still clutching it, the instinct to protect my valuable gear ingrained after years of fieldwork. With shaking hands, I unzipped my backpack and pulled out the satellite phone. As I fumbled to turn it on, my heart sank into the pit of my stomach. The screen remained stubbornly dark. Dead battery? I'd been so utterly absorbed in my photography over the past few days that I'd completely neglected to charge it. A crushing wave of despair washed over me. I was utterly alone, being hunted by armed, desperate men with absolutely no way to call for help. For a fleeting moment, I actually considered surrendering. Perhaps if I explained, if I promised to delete the photos. No, I couldn't possibly take that risk. These men had already demonstrated their chilling willingness to kill. I had to keep going. I had to find a way out of this nightmare. I allowed myself a few more precious minutes of rest, then reluctantly emerged from the dubious safety of my rocky shelter. The sun was high in the sky now, its relentless heat making my clothes cling unpleasantly to my sweat-drenched skin. I desperately needed to find water soon, or dehydration would become as immediate and deadly a threat as the poachers themselves. I continued moving, meticulously sticking to areas with more natural cover. Every snapping twig made me flinch violently, every shifting shadow seemed to conceal a hidden threat. Hours bled into one another this way, the relentless strain of constant vigilance taking an agonizing toll. As the light began to softly fade, I knew I needed to find a place, any place, to spend the night. The chilling thought of being out here in the pitch black, knowing those men were still actively searching for me, made my skin crawl. But I had no other choice. I located a dense thicket of thorny bushes and crawled inside, ignoring the painful scratches from the branches. It wasn't comfortable in the slightest, but it offered a measure of concealment. I curled up, attempting to make myself as small and inconspicuous as possible. Sleep was an absolute impossibility. Every distant sound sent a jolt of terror through me, making me tense, expecting to see the glint of a gun barrel poking through the leaves. I clutched my camera bag tightly to my chest, the evidence it contained now feeling far more like a curse than an asset. As the first faint light of dawn began to filter tentatively through the dense leaves, I heard a new sound, a rhythmic thudding that grew steadily louder by the second. I held my breath, not daring to move a single muscle. The thudding grew into a roaring crescendo, and then, suddenly, a large, dark shape passed directly overhead. A helicopter. My heart leaped with a frantic, desperate hope someone was looking for me. I burst out of my cramped hiding place, waving my arms frantically, my voice raw as I screamed for attention. The helicopter circled back, hovering lower, its powerful rotors churning the air. I could clearly make out the words Forest Service emblazoned on its side. As it finally touched down in a nearby clearing, a wave of profound relief, so overwhelming it nearly buckled my knees, washed over me. Park rangers poured out, rushing swiftly to my side, their questions a blurry, indistinct murmur. Was I hurt? Were the men still in the area? Did I need immediate medical attention? I managed to stammer out my harrowing story, physically handing them my camera to show them the damning photos. Their faces grew grim, their expressions hardening as they grasped the full extent of what I had unwittingly uncovered. One of the rangers, an older man with kind, knowing eyes, gently placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. "You've been incredibly brave," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "But you're safe now. We'll take care of everything from here." As they led me towards the helicopter, I took one last, lingering look at the vast, untamed wilderness around me. It was as breathtakingly beautiful as ever, the morning sun painting the landscape in soft, golden light. But now I truly knew the darkness that could lurk, hidden and malevolent, even in the most ostensibly beautiful places. I was alive. I had survived. And I possessed the irrefutable evidence to bring those ruthless poachers to justice. As the helicopter lifted off, carrying me back towards the distant promise of safety, I made a silent, solemn promise to myself. I would return to the wild. I would not allow this terrifying experience to rob me of my deep-seated passion. But next time, I would be better prepared, far more cautious, and perhaps, just perhaps, a little bit braver. Story 6. The moment the stranger emerged from the deepening shadows. His eyes wide with an unnerving intensity and his smile unnaturally broad, I knew our peaceful camping trip had taken a sinister turn. Little did we realize he wasn't alone, and our night was about to spiral into a desperate struggle for mere survival. This was meant to be a perfect weekend escape, just me, my best friend Liam, and his girlfriend Chloe. We were craving an escape from the relentless chaos of city life, yearning for a few days of fresh, crisp air and nights blanketed by starlight. We'd found what seemed like an ideal spot. Tucked away in a quiet, secluded corner of the national forest, far from the bustling crowds of typical campgrounds and the noisy hum of RV parks. The first day had unfolded exactly as we'd hoped. We'd hiked through sun-dappled forests, marveled at sparkling waterfalls, and shared easy laughter around the crackling campfire as we roasted marshmallows and swapped old stories. As the embers of our fire gradually dimmed and the night deepened around us, we crawled into our tents, tired but utterly content. I was jolted abruptly awake by the distinct sound of twigs snapping nearby. At first, my groggy mind dismissed it as an animal, perhaps a curious raccoon drawn by the lingering scent of our dinner. But then, I heard something that sent a bone-chilling dread coursing through my veins. Whistling, a jaunty, off-key tune that felt utterly out of place in the dead of night. Deep in the heart of the woods, I lay perfectly still, straining my ears against the oppressive silence. The whistling grew louder, punctuated by the unmistakable crunch of leaves underfoot. Someone was deliberately walking through our campsite. "Hello there, campers," a voice called out, far too cheerful, too bright for the hour. "Anyone awake?" I heard Liam stirring in the tent beside mine. "What the hell?" he muttered, his voice thick with sleep and confusion. Hesitantly, I unzipped my tent and poked my head out. The sight that greeted me was profoundly unsettling, illuminated eerily by the pale moonlight. A man stood in the center of our campsite. He was tall and gangly, dressed in ragged, well-worn clothes that had clearly seen better days. His beard was a wild, unkempt mess of white, and his eyes, there was something profoundly wrong with them. They were too wide, too unnervingly bright, darting around with an almost manic intensity. "There you are," he exclaimed, a wide, unsettling grin stretching across his face. "I was starting to think you all might be dead in there. Wouldn't that have been a shame?" Liam emerged from his tent, Chloe close behind him. I could clearly see the confusion and dawning unease etched on their faces, mirroring my own. "Can we help you with something?" Liam asked, his voice cautious, carefully measured. The stranger's grin widened even further. "Oh, I'm sure you can. I'm Daniel, by the way. I couldn't help but notice your lovely little setup here. Looks cozy." He took a deliberate step closer, and we instinctively recoiled, backing away. "Thing is," he continued, his voice dropping slightly, "it's not safe out here. All sorts of dangers in these woods. I've got a much better spot. Nice and secure. Why don't you all come with me?" Alarm bells screamed in my head. Every primal instinct shrieked that this was profoundly wrong, that we needed to escape this man, and swiftly. "Thanks for the offer," I said, striving desperately to keep my voice steady, "but we're fine here. We'll be heading out in the morning anyway." Daniel's unsettling smile faltered for a brief moment, a flash of something dark and chilling crossing his face. "I really think you should reconsider. It's not a request, you see. It's more of a strong suggestion." That's when we heard it. Rustling in the dense bushes surrounding our campsite, More footsteps coming from all directions. My heart began to pound a frantic, deafening rhythm in my ears as dark. Indistinct figures began to emerge from the trees, forming a loose, ominous circle around us. "Oh God," Chloe whispered, her voice a terrified whimper, clutching Liam's arm. There were 5 of them, men and women, all bearing the same wild, desperate look in their eyes as Daniel. They were dressed in a mismatched assortment of outdoor gear and tattered clothing. And I distinctly spotted at least 2 glinting knives among them. "Now then," Daniel said, his voice losing its forced cheerfulness, a cold edge replacing it, "let's try this again. You're coming with us unless you'd prefer to take your chances out here." Liam stepped forward, instinctively placing himself between the menacing strangers and Chloe. "Look, we don't want any trouble. Just take what you want and leave us alone." One of the other men, a burly figure with a shaved head, let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "What we want is you, city boy. Now move your asses before we have to get rough." My mind raced, frantically searching for an exit. We were hopelessly outnumbered and utterly unarmed. Save for a small camping knife tucked away in my tent. Even if we could somehow reach our car, they had us completely surrounded. Running blindly into the dark, unforgiving woods would be suicide. "Okay," I said, raising my hands in what I hoped was a placating gesture. "Okay, we'll come with you. Just give us a minute to grab our things." Daniel nodded, that unnerving grin once again spreading across his face. "Smart choice, but don't try anything stupid. We'll be watching." With trembling hands, we began to gather our belongings. As I ducked into my tent, I managed to subtly slip my small camping knife into my pocket without being noticed. It wasn't much, but it was something. They marched us through the dense forest, deeper and deeper into the trackless wilderness. The moon had vanished behind a thick shroud of clouds, plunging us into near-total darkness. I stumbled repeatedly over gnarled roots and sharp rocks, the group's rough hands shoving me forward whenever my pace faltered. After what felt like endless hours, though it was likely less, we finally arrived at a clearing. Crude, makeshift shelters fashioned from tarps and branches were scattered haphazardly, and a large, central fire pit dominated the scene. It was clear they had been living out here for quite some time. "Welcome home," Daniel said, spreading his arms wide with a chilling theatricality. "Well, you're home for now, anyway." They herded us towards one of the shelters, a ramshackle lean-to that reeked of damp earth and stale mold. As they shoved us inside, my eyes met Liam's, a silent, desperate understanding passing between us. We needed to find a way out of this, and soon. The next few hours blurred into a suffocating haze of fear and tension. Our captors took turns guarding us, their unblinking eyes never straying from the entrance to our makeshift prison. I could hear them arguing amongst themselves, their voices too low and guttural to make out the words, but the angry undertones were unmistakable. As the first faint streaks of dawn began to paint the sky, casting a pale, ghostly light through the gaps in our crude shelter, I felt a gentle tap on my shoulder. Liam nodded subtly towards the back of the lean-to, where a section of the covering had come loose. It wasn't much, barely a gap, but it might just be enough for us to slip through. We waited, our hearts pounding a frantic drumbeat, for the precise moment when the guard's attention wavered for just a second, distracted by something else in the camp. Then we made our move. I went first, wriggling through the narrow gap as quietly as I possibly could. The rough edges of the branches scraped painfully against my skin, but I barely registered it. Adrenaline was coursing through my veins, every sense hyper-alert. Liam came next, then he helped Chloe through. We crouched low in the underbrush, hardly daring to breathe. The camp was just beginning to stir, early risers moving about, but no one had yet noticed our audacious escape. "Which way?" Chloe whispered, her voice trembling uncontrollably. I pointed in the direction I believed we had come from the night before. "We'll have to risk it. Staying here isn't an option." We began to move, slowly at first, then faster as we put precious distance between ourselves and the camp. The forest was awakening with the sounds of morning. Birdsong, rustling leaves, the chattering of squirrels. But it all faded into background noise, drowned out by the thunderous pounding of my heart and our ragged, desperate breathing. We'd been running for perhaps 10 minutes when we heard the first shout. They had discovered we were gone. Faster, Liam gasped, grabbing Chloe's hand and pulling her along. I could hear them crashing through the forest behind us, their angry voices carrying on the chill wind. They knew these woods far better than we did, and they were relentlessly gaining on us. Up ahead, I spotted a break in the trees. As we burst out of the forest, my heart plummeted with a sickening lurch. We were at the edge of a steep ravine, a churning, roaring river far, far below. "We're trapped," Chloe cried, pure panic evident in her voice. The sounds of pursuit grew chillingly louder. We had seconds, at most, before they caught up to us. I looked at the raging water below, then back at my friends. It was a terrible, desperate choice, but it was the only one we had. "We have to jump," I said, the words feeling alien on my tongue. Liam's eyes widened in disbelief, but then a grim understanding dawned on his face. He nodded resolutely. "On three," he said, gripping Chloe's hand tightly. "1, 2. There they are." Daniel's voice, laced with triumph and malice, rang out directly behind us. 3. We leapt, just as our pursuers broke through the tree line. For a breathtaking moment, we were flying, the wind tearing past us. Then we hit the frigid water, and the world dissolved into a chaotic maelstrom of churning currents and desperate, choking gasps for air. I don't know how long we were in that river. It felt like an eternity. But it was likely only minutes. Eventually, miraculously, the current slowed enough for us to make our grueling way to the shore, coughing and sputtering as we dragged our battered bodies onto the rocky bank. I looked back up at the ravine. There was no sign of Daniel or his sinister group. We'd made it. We were battered, bruised and soaked to the bone, but we were alive and we were free. The trek back to civilization was long and arduous, but fueled by the lingering, raw terror of being found, we pushed on. When we finally stumbled into a ranger station and recounted our unbelievable story, the look of profound shock on the rangers' faces told us just how incredibly lucky we had been. In the days that followed, as we gave statements to the police and struggled to process the nightmare we had endured, one chilling truth became undeniably clear. Our simple camping trip had spiraled into an unthinkable ordeal, but it had also, paradoxically, revealed to us just how resilient and strong we could be when pushed to our absolute limits. I know, deep down, that I'll go camping again someday. The irresistible call of the wild is simply too strong for me to ever resist. But I will never again take the serene peace and profound safety of the wilderness for granted. Because now I know with a chilling certainty that sometimes the most dangerous predators in the forest walk on two legs. Story 7. The moment I heard their voices drifting across the still, glass-like surface of the lake, I knew my solitary canoe trip had veered into a sinister realm. What I didn't realize was how swiftly my peaceful retreat would transform into a desperate fight for survival. I've always been something of a lone wolf, preferring the quiet companionship of nature to the overwhelming chaos of the city. That yearning for solitude is precisely what drew me to embark on a week-long canoe expedition through the legendary boundary waters of Minnesota. Just me, my faithful canoe, and mile upon mile of pristine wilderness stretching out in every direction. The initial few days were everything I had envisioned. I paddled effortlessly through crystal-clear lakes, navigated rugged portage trails with a satisfying sense of accomplishment, and slept beneath a boundless canopy of stars so intensely bright they literally stole my breath away. The solitude was intoxicating, a profound balm for my stress-worn soul. On the 4th day, I discovered what felt like the quintessential campsite. A small, rocky islet nestled squarely in the middle of a vast lake. It was barely large enough to pitch my tent, but its strategic location offered an unobstructed, panoramic view in every direction. As I meticulously set up camp, a deep sense of peace washed over me. This, I affirmed, was precisely why I had come out here. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the expanse of sky in brilliant, fiery hues of orange and pink, I noticed something subtly out of place. A lone canoe far off on the distant shoreline. It wasn't entirely unusual to spot other paddlers out here, but something about this particular one immediately snagged my attention. It was moving erratically, zigzagging along the shoreline as if conducting a meticulous search for something. I watched it for a long while through my binoculars, my curiosity piqued. There were two men in the canoe, both clad in dark clothing. They seemed to be in the midst of a heated argument, gesturing angrily at each other and towards the shoreline. Eventually, they steered their canoe into a small, secluded cove and vanished into the dense trees. I shrugged it off, dismissing the oddity and redirecting my attention back to the task of preparing my camp for the night. But as darkness inexorably fell, an unsettling, cold feeling began to settle deep within my gut. Something about those men simply hadn't seemed right. I was jolted violently awake in the dead of night by the distinct sound of voices carrying clearly across the water. At first, my groggy mind tried to convince itself I was dreaming, out here. The only nocturnal sounds should be the haunting cries of loons and the gentle lapping of waves against the shore. But as I strained to listen, the voices grew undeniably clearer. "It has to be around here somewhere," one voice growled, gruff and impatient. "We've been searching for hours," another replied. "Maybe we should wait until daylight." I held my breath, desperate to glean more information. Were these the same men I'd seen earlier? And what on earth were they looking for? A powerful beam of light abruptly cut through the pervasive darkness, sweeping methodically across the water. They were using a spotlight, systematically searching the shoreline. I ducked down instinctively, profoundly grateful for the diminutive size of my island. In the enveloping darkness, it would be remarkably easy to miss. As I lay there, my heart pounding a frantic drumbeat, I frantically cycled through possible scenarios in my mind. Perhaps they were just fellow campers who had lost something? But the late hour, their secretive behavior, the intense search, it all pointed to something far more sinister. The voices grew chillingly closer, and I risked a cautious peek out of my tent. I could now distinctly see their canoe, a dark, silent shape gliding ominously across the moonlit water. They were heading directly for my island. Panic surged through me, a suffocating wave. I had nowhere to run, absolutely nowhere to hide. My small island suddenly felt like an inescapable prison. I scrambled frantically to gather my most vital gear: my emergency radio, water filter, and a small bag of trail mix. With shaking hands, I crammed them into a dry bag and silently slipped into the water on the far side of the island, using my tent as a precarious cover. The water was shockingly cold, and I had to bite my lip until it bled to keep from gasping aloud. I submerged myself up to my neck, clinging desperately to a rocky outcropping as I watched the dark canoe approach. It bumped softly against the shore of my island, and two men climbed out. In the pale moonlight, I could now see them more clearly. They were rough-looking, with unkempt beards and clothes that had clearly seen better days. One carried the powerful spotlight, the other a large, bulky duffel bag. "Check the tent," the man with the spotlight ordered, his voice low and urgent. His companion unzipped my tent and ducked inside. "Empty," he reported, his voice flat, but still warm. "Someone was here recently." "Damn it," the first man swore, his voice laced with frustration. Where could they have gone? They began to meticulously search the tiny island, a process that, given its small size, didn't take long. I pressed myself even closer to the rough rocks, praying with every fiber of my being that they wouldn't think to look in the water. The cold was seeping deep into my bones, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could stay submerged without starting to shiver uncontrollably. As they completed their quick search, I overheard chilling snippets of their conversation. Words like stash, border, and patrol floated menacingly across the water. With a sinking, horrifying feeling, I realized the terrible truth. I had stumbled upon drug smugglers. utilizing the remote wilderness to covertly move their product across the Canadian border. After what felt like an eternity, though it was likely only minutes, the men returned to their canoe. "He couldn't have gone far," one said. "Let's check the next island over." I watched, frozen, as they paddled away, their voices gradually fading into the oppressive silence of the night. Only when I was absolutely certain they were completely gone did I finally allow myself to climb out of the water, my limbs stiff and aching from the bone-chilling cold. I knew with a certainty that I couldn't remain here. They would undoubtedly return to search again, and next time I might not be so fortunate. But I also knew that attempting to paddle away in the treacherous darkness would be incredibly dangerous, if not outright impossible. I was trapped with no immediate alternative. I gathered what little gear I could salvage and retreated to the densest patch of undergrowth on the island. It wasn't much, but it would have to suffice. I huddled there, wet and utterly miserable. As the night dragged on, every subtle sound made me flinch. The splash of a fish, the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. I kept expecting to see the searing beam of their spotlight cutting through the darkness again. But as the sky began to lighten with the first faint hints of dawn, I was still miraculously alone. As soon as there was enough light to safely see, I broke camp as swiftly and silently as humanly possible. I loaded my canoe, my eyes constantly scanning the expansive lake for any sign of the men. The thick morning mist hung low over the water, providing a welcome blanket of cover, but also making it incredibly difficult to see very far. I pushed off, paddling with desperate, agonizing strength. I knew I needed to put as much distance as I possibly could between myself and this perilous place. But I also knew that out on the vast, open water, I would be entirely exposed and vulnerable if they were to spot me. For grueling hours I paddled, my muscles screaming in protest with every stroke. Every time I heard the faint, distant sound of a motor or caught a fleeting shape moving through the mist, I would immediately duck into a secluded cove or behind an island, my heart hammering. It was mid-afternoon when I finally heard it. The unmistakable sound of a canoe cutting purposefully through the water. I peered cautiously around the edge of the small island I'd been using for cover and saw them, the two men, paddling hard, their eyes meticulously scanning the lake. They were following my trail. I ducked back, my mind racing. I couldn't possibly outrun them, they were fresher, and their canoe was lighter without all the bulky camping gear. I needed another plan. That's when I spotted it. A narrow, almost hidden channel leading into a dizzying maze of small islands and shallow reefs. It would be incredibly tricky to navigate, especially in a loaded canoe, but I knew, with a sudden surge of certainty, that it was my only chance. Taking a deep, ragged breath, I pushed off and made a desperate break for the channel. Almost immediately, I heard shouts behind me. They had spotted me. What followed was the most intense, heart-pounding paddling of my entire life. I weaved frantically through the narrow channel, scraping precariously over hidden rocks and squeezing through gaps barely wider than my canoe. All the while, I could hear them behind me, their frustrated curses echoing off the rocky shores as they struggled to follow. I was running on pure adrenaline, every muscle straining as I pushed myself to my absolute limit. I knew that one wrong turn, one single mistake, could mean the stark difference between escape and capture. Finally, after what felt like an eternity but was probably only minutes, I burst out of the winding maze into open water. In the distant, shimmering haze, I could make out buildings, a ranger station nestled on the very edge of the boundary waters. With a final, desperate surge of energy, I paddled furiously towards it. I could still hear the men behind me, but their voices were fainter now. They wouldn't dare follow me to the ranger station. As I pulled up to the dock, my legs shaking so badly I could barely stand, a ranger emerged to meet me. One look at my wild-eyed, terrified face must have told him something was terribly wrong. "Are you all right?" he asked, rushing to help me out of the canoe. The entire horrifying story came pouring out of me then, the suspicious men, the midnight search, my desperate flight through the wilderness. The ranger listened gravely, then immediately radioed for backup. In the days that followed, as I gave my statements to the police and struggled to process what had happened, one chilling truth became clear. My peaceful canoe trip had transformed into a living nightmare, but it had also, paradoxically, shown me just how incredibly strong and resilient I could be when pushed to my absolute limits. I know deep in my soul that I'll return to the boundary water someday. The untamed beauty of that wilderness is simply too powerful to ever resist. But I will never again take the profound solitude for granted, because now I know with a chilling certainty that even in the most remote, pristine places, darkness can find you. And when it does, you have to be ready to fight with every fiber of your being. Story 8. The moment I saw the fresh footprints in the thick dust of the abandoned cabin, a cold dread coiled in my stomach. What I didn't know was how swiftly our casual curiosity would plunge us into a desperate fight for survival. It was meant to be a simple weekend hike, just me and Sarah. We'd been dating for a few months, and this was our very first real getaway together. Both of us shared a deep love for the outdoors and the promise of exploring an old, forgotten logging trail in the misty Cascades seemed like the perfect adventure. The weather that Saturday morning was absolutely perfect as we set off. The late summer sun warming our backs as we trudged steadily up the overgrown trail. Sarah was a few paces ahead of me, her blonde ponytail swinging rhythmically with each step. I found myself smiling, feeling incredibly lucky to be there, sharing this moment with her. We'd been hiking for about 3 hours when we first spotted the cabin. It was nestled in a small, secluded clearing, half hidden by the encroaching, dense forest. The wooden structure looked ancient, its walls weathered to a ghostly gray by countless seasons. "Hey, check that out!" I called to Sarah, pointing towards the cabin. She turned, her eyes lighting up with immediate curiosity. "Oh, wow. I wonder how old it is." We approached cautiously, our eyes meticulously scanning the area for any signs of recent activity. The cabin genuinely appeared to have been abandoned for decades, with thick vines creeping possessively up its walls and a dense carpet of pine needles blanketing its sagging roof. "Should we take a look inside?" Sarah asked, a distinct hint of excitement bubbling in her voice. I hesitated. Something about the cabin, an intangible sense, made me profoundly uneasy, though I couldn't quite pinpoint why. "I don't know." I mumbled it might not be safe. But Sarah was already moving towards the door, her boundless curiosity getting the better of her. "Come on, just a quick peek. Where's your sense of adventure?" Sighing, I followed her up the creaky wooden steps to the porch. The door was slightly ajar, and Sarah pushed it open with a dramatic creak that echoed ominously through the silent trees. The interior of the cabin was dim, shafts of dusty sunlight filtering weakly through the grimy, cobwebbed windows. It was a single, Spartan room with an old, rusty iron stove in one corner and a crude wooden table in the center. A rickety ladder led up to a small loft area. As my eyes slowly adjusted to the pervasive gloom, I noticed something profoundly odd. There were fresh, distinct marks in the thick dust on the floor. Footprints. "Sarah," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "I don't think we're alone out here." She turned to look where I was pointing, her eyes widening perceptibly as she saw the prints. "Maybe it's just other hikers?" she suggested, though I could clearly hear the uncertainty quivering in her voice. I shook my head, my gaze fixed on the prints. "The trail's been empty all day, and look, those prints lead directly to the loft." We both looked up at the dark, yawning opening above us. For a long, agonizing moment, the cabin was utterly silent. Then we heard it, a faint, distinct shuffling sound from above. Sarah's fingers dug into my arm, her grip surprisingly tight. "We need to go," she hissed, her voice barely audible. I nodded, already instinctively backing towards the door. But before we could even reach it, a figure materialized at the top of the ladder, a man, his face obscured in deep shadow, looking down at us. Well, he said, his voice a low, gravelly menace. What do we have here? My heart was pounding so violently I could barely hear over the roaring rush of blood in my ears. I instinctively pushed Sarah behind me, shielding her, moving towards the door. We're sorry, I stammered, trying desperately to keep my voice steady. We didn't know anyone was here. We'll leave now. The man chuckled, a chilling sound devoid of any real humor. I'm afraid I can't let you do that. You see, you've stumbled into something you weren't supposed to see. As he spoke, he began his slow, deliberate descent down the ladder. In the dim light, I could make out his appearance, dirty, ragged clothes, an unkempt beard, and eyes that held a wild, dangerous glint. Sarah tugged urgently at my arm. Run, she hissed. We bolted for the door, but as we burst onto the porch, two more men emerged from the trees, seemingly out of nowhere. They were similarly disheveled, and one of them was casually holding a wicked-looking hunting knife. Going somewhere? The knife wielder asked, a wide, malevolent grin revealing yellowed teeth. We were trapped. My mind raced, desperately trying to conjure a way out of this waking nightmare. The man from the loft had now reached the bottom of the ladder and was steadily advancing towards us. Listen, I said, holding up my hands in what I hoped was a calming, non-threatening gesture. We don't want any trouble. We won't say anything about what we've seen here. Just let us go. The man with the knife laughed, a harsh, guttural sound that sent fresh chills down my spine. Oh, I'm sure you won't say anything. We'll make sure of that. Sarah whimpered softly beside me, and a surge of primal, protective anger ignited within me. Without a conscious thought, I grabbed an old, heavy iron poker from beside the stove and swung it with all my might at the nearest man. He ducked just in time, but the sudden distraction was enough. I shoved Sarah fiercely towards the door. Run! I yelled. We burst out of the cabin, the angry shouts of the men close behind us. We sprinted into the dense forest, branches whipping violently at our faces as we crashed wildly through the underbrush. I could hear them pursuing us, their furious voices carrying clearly through the trees. Sarah was just ahead of me, her breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. I knew with a sinking feeling that we couldn't outrun them for long. They undoubtedly knew these woods far better than we did. This way, I gasped, grabbing Sarah's hand and abruptly veering off the faint trail. I'd spotted a dense thicket, and I desperately hoped it might offer us some concealment. We dove headlong into the bushes, thorns tearing at our skin as we burrowed in as deep as we possibly could. I pulled Sarah close, both of us struggling desperately to quiet our ragged breathing as we heard our pursuers drawing ominously near. Where'd they go? One of them shouted, his voice laced with frustration. They can't have gotten far, another replied. Spread out and find them. We lay there, barely daring to breathe, as the men systematically searched the immediate area. I could catch glimpses of them through the thick leaves, moving back and forth, their frustration palpable in their voices. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few agonizing minutes, their voices began to slowly fade. They were moving away deeper into the forest. I think they're gone, Sarah whispered, her voice still trembling. I nodded, but gestured for her to remain utterly silent. We waited a few more tense minutes, straining our ears for any sound of the men returning. Finally, when I was as certain as I could possibly be that the coast was clear, we carefully, painfully extracted ourselves from the thorny thicket. We were scratched and bruised, our clothes torn and muddied, but we were alive. We need to get back to the car, I said, trying desperately to orient myself. In our blind panic, we'd run quite a distance off the trail. Sarah nodded, her face pale but etched with grim determination. Which way? She asked. I looked around, trying to recall the route we'd taken, but the forest now looked entirely different. Far more menacing, Every elongated shadow seemed to hide a lurking threat. "I think this way," I said, pointing, hoping I sounded far more confident than I felt. We set off, moving as quickly and quietly as we could. Every snapping twig made us flinch violently. Every rustle in the undergrowth sent a fresh jolt of fear through us, causing us to freeze in place. The forest that had seemed so breathtakingly beautiful just that morning now felt like a suffocating, green prison. After what felt like an eternity of tense, anxious hiking, we finally spotted a familiar landmark, a distinctive bent tree we'd passed on our way up. Relief, warm and comforting, flooded through me as I realized we were, indeed, on the right track. "We're close," I told Sarah, squeezing her hand, but our relief was tragically short-lived. As we rounded a bend in the trail, we came face to face with one of our relentless pursuers. He looked as utterly surprised to see us as we were to see him. For a frozen moment, all three of us stood still, locked in a silent tableau of shock. Then Sarah reacted. She grabbed a large, heavy branch from the ground and swung it with all her might at the man's head. Connected with a sickening thud, and he went down, collapsing instantly. "Run!" Sarah yelled, and we took off down the trail, sprinting. We could hear shouts behind us as the man's companions discovered him, but we had a precious head start now, and sheer desperation lent an incredible speed to our tired feet. Finally, mercifully, we burst out of the tree line into the gravel parking area where we'd left our car. I fumbled frantically with the keys, my hands shaking so violently I could barely get them into the lock. Just as I heard the distinct sound of pursuit breaking through the trees, we tumbled into the car. I started the engine and floored the accelerator, gravel spraying wildly as we peeled out of the lot. In the rearview mirror, I could see the men emerging from the forest, their faces contorted with pure rage, but they were getting smaller, more distant with every passing second. We'd made it. We drove in silence for a long while, both of us trying to process the raw, unbelievable events that had just transpired. It wasn't until we were back on the main highway that Sarah finally spoke. What do you think they were doing out there?" she asked, her voice still shaky. I shook my head, my gaze fixed on the road ahead. "I don't know. Nothing good. Maybe they were cooking meth or hiding out from the law. Either way, I'm just glad we got away." Sarah nodded, her hand reaching over to take mine. "Me too. I've never been so scared in my life." As the miles steadily rolled by, putting more and more distance between us and that nightmare in the woods, I found myself reflecting on how quickly everything had changed. What had begun as a pleasant, carefree hike had spiraled into a terrifying fight for survival. I knew we'd need to report what had happened to the authorities. Those men were dangerous, and who knew how many other unsuspecting hikers might stumble into their trap. But for now, I was simply grateful to be alive, grateful to be here with Sarah, heading home. The forest had shown us its darker, more menacing side today, a stark reminder that even in the most beautiful places, danger can lurk just out of sight. I squeezed Sarah's hand, feeling a newfound, profound appreciation for her strength and her quick thinking. We'd faced this together, and somehow we'd made it through. Whatever came next, I knew we'd face it together too. As we drove on towards home and safety, I made a silent promise to myself. I'd return to the mountains someday. I wouldn't let this experience rob me of my love for the wilderness. But next time, I'd be more prepared, more vigilant, because now I knew with a chilling certainty that sometimes the most dangerous things in the forest walk on two legs. Story 9. The moment I found the first cryptic note pinned to a gnarled pine near my campsite, a creeping chill traversed my spine. My peaceful research trip, I realized with a jolt, had taken a deeply sinister turn. What I didn't yet grasp was how swiftly it would escalate into a terrifying game of cat and mouse in the sprawling, untamed wilderness. I had ventured into the vast Adirondacks to meticulously study the nuanced impact of climate change on high-altitude flora. This was meant to be a month-long solo expedition, just me and the majestic mountains. I'd undertaken trips like this many times before, always relishing the profound solitude. The rare chance to utterly immerse myself in nature without the incessant clamor of distractions. The first week unfolded precisely as I had hoped. I established a base camp in a small, secluded clearing, conveniently close to a babbling brook that provided a constant supply of fresh, clear water. Each day, I would embark on arduous hikes to different elevations, meticulously documenting plant species and carefully collecting soil samples. The work was utterly engrossing, and the surrounding scenery was breathtaking in its raw beauty. In the evenings, I'd return to my snug tent, diligently record my findings, and drift off to sleep lulled by the gentle, comforting sounds of the forest. It was on the 8th day that everything irrevocably shifted. I was returning from a particularly grueling hike when a subtle anomaly caught my eye. A scrap of paper, conspicuously attached to a pine tree near the familiar outline of my tent. My curiosity, ever my undoing, piqued. I approached cautiously and pulled it free. The message, scrawled in messy, almost childlike handwriting, sent a chilling shiver down my spine. "I see you." I spun around, my gaze sweeping frantically across my surroundings, suddenly acutely aware of how utterly exposed I was. The forest, which had felt so welcoming and embracing just moments before, now seemed to loom menacingly, teeming with unseen, hidden threats. "It's probably just some hiker playing a prank," I tried to rationalize to myself, my voice barely a whisper in the sudden silence. But a persistent, nagging doubt clung stubbornly to the back of my mind. I slept fitfully that night, jolting awake at every rustle, every creak of a branch. The next morning, I seriously contemplated packing up my entire camp and leaving immediately. But the thought of abandoning weeks of meticulously planned research over what might genuinely be a harmless joke seemed utterly ridiculous. So I stayed, though I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder as I worked, a pervasive sense of unease clinging to me. 2 days passed without further incident, and I gradually began to relax, convincing myself that it had indeed been a one-off and isolated prank after all. But when I returned to camp on the 3rd day, a fresh wave of ice-cold dread washed over me. Another note. This time, it was brazenly pinned directly to my tent. The message was stark, chilling in its simplicity. "You shouldn't be here." Fear, cold and gripping, seized me. This was no longer a joke. Someone was watching me, stalking me through the vast wilderness. But why? What did they want? I lunged for my satellite phone, intending to call for help, my fingers fumbling with urgency. My heart plummeted, the screen remained stubbornly dark. Dead battery? Panic surged through me as the horrifying realization sank in. The battery had been deliberately removed. Whoever was doing this had been in my tent, had gone through my personal belongings. I needed to leave, immediately. But as I began to frantically pack up my essential gear, a terrifying thought struck me. What if they were out there, right now, watching my every move? Would they attempt to stop me if I tried to hike out? As if in chilling answer to my unspoken question, a twig snapped sharply in the woods directly behind me. I whirled around, my heart pounding a deafening rhythm, but saw nothing but the familiar, shifting tapestry of trees and shadows. The forest suddenly felt alive with palpable menace, every rustle of leaves a potential, looming threat. I made a split-second, desperate decision, grabbing only my backpack. Crammed with a few essential supplies, I bolted down the trail, abandoning the rest of my camp gear. I had to get back to civilization, to safety. The hike out should have taken approximately 6 hours, but as darkness inexorably fell, a growing dread coiled in my gut. I was utterly lost. In my blind panic, I must have taken a wrong turn. The faint trail I was on was becoming less and less distinct, overgrown in places. I was deep in a part of the forest I didn't recognize. As the last vestiges of light faded from the sky, I was forced to concede defeat and stop. Hiking in the pitch dark would be far too dangerous. I found a small hollow beneath the sprawling roots of a large oak tree and huddled there, too terrified to even attempt sleep. Every sound, however innocuous, made me flinch. The mournful hoot of an owl, the scurrying of some tiny, unseen animal, the wind whistling eerily through the trees. But far worse than the sounds were the chilling silences when I strained my ears for any hint of approach and heard nothing. Dawn found me utterly exhausted and on razor's edge. As I painstakingly crawled out of my makeshift shelter, my heart nearly stopped. There, impaled on the rough trunk of the very oak tree I'd huddled beneath, was another note. You can't hide. They had found me in the dead of night. They had been close enough to leave a note while I huddled, utterly unaware, mere feet away. The horrifying realization sent a wave of nausea washing over me. I started running then. All attempts at stealth abandoned. I crashed frantically through the underbrush, branches whipping painfully at my face, gnarled roots threatening to trip me at every desperate stride. I had no idea if I was even heading in the right direction, but I knew with a primal certainty that I couldn't stay still. Hours bled into a blur of raw terror and punishing exhaustion. My legs ached with a searing pain, my lungs burned, but still, I pushed on. As the day wore on, I began to hear things, faint twigs snapping, leaves rustling, always behind me. Always just out of sight. Was I truly being pursued? Or was my fear-addled mind simply playing cruel tricks on me? As the sun began to set for the second time since my desperate flight began, I stumbled upon an old fire tower. It loomed starkly above the trees, a skeletal metal frame silhouetted against the darkening sky. With no better options, I began to climb. The metal rungs were slick with dew, and my trembling hands made the ascent treacherous, but finally, agonizingly, I reached the small, enclosed room at the very top. It was empty, long abandoned. But it had a door that miraculously locked. For the very first time in days, a fragile glimmer of hope ignited within me. I huddled in a corner of the tiny room, watching as night fell completely over the vast forest. From this elevated vantage point, I could see for miles in every direction. Surely, I thought, I would be able to spot anyone approaching. As the hours crawled by, my crushing exhaustion began to slowly overtake my fear. Despite my desperate best efforts, I felt my eyelids growing heavy. I drifted into an uneasy, nightmare-filled sleep, plagued by visions of faceless pursuers. I awoke with a violent start, unsure how long I'd been asleep. The first faint rays of dawn were just beginning to lighten the sky. And there, propped impossibly against the far wall of the room, was a piece of paper that absolutely had not been there when I fell asleep. With shaking hands, I unfolded it. "Look behind you." I whirled around, a choked scream caught in my throat, but there was no one there, just the door, still securely locked from the inside. How was this possible? Whoever was doing this? They weren't just tracking me, they were toying with me, savoring my terror. In that precise moment, something deep within me snapped. The paralyzing fear that had driven me for days transformed, solidified into a cold, hard anger. I was done running, done being a victim. It was time to turn the tables. I spent the entire day in the tower, meticulously conserving my dwindling energy, formulating a desperate plan. I took careful stock of my meager supplies and fashioned a crude, heavy weapon from a broken piece of the tower's railing. As night fell once more, I began my slow, silent descent, moving as quietly as I possibly could. I began to backtrack, meticulously following my own distinct trail from the previous day. If my relentless stalker had been so closely following me, perhaps now I could catch them unawares. For grueling hours, I crept through the darkened forest, every sense on high alert. The night was alive with a symphony of sounds, but I forced myself to move steadily, purposefully. I would not be the prey any longer. It was nearing dawn when I finally saw it, a faint, flickering glow through the trees, a campfire. My heart pounded a furious rhythm as I approached, moving cautiously from tree to tree for cover. And then I saw him, a man sitting calmly by the fire, writing something on a piece of paper. Even from a distance, I recognized the messy, taunting scrawl. Rage, pure and unadulterated, flooded through me. This was the person who had terrorized me, who had twisted my peaceful research trip into a living nightmare. Without conscious thought, driven by an almost animalistic fury, I found myself moving towards him, my makeshift weapon raised high. He must have heard something, some subtle shift, because he looked up suddenly, his eyes widening in pure shock as he saw me. He scrambled frantically to his feet, but it was already too late. What happened next was a blur of primal motion. There was a struggle, shouts echoing brutally through the pre-dawn forest. When it was finally over, I stood over him, breathing heavily, my improvised club still gripped tightly in my hand. He was alive but utterly unconscious. As the last vestiges of adrenaline faded, I began to shake uncontrollably. What had I done? What should I do now? In the end, I used some rope from his own supplies to securely tie him up. Then, using his satellite phone, miraculously functional, unlike my own sabotaged one, I called for help. The authorities arrived a few hours later. As it turned out, the man was a known offender, wanted for a chilling series of similar incidents in other parks. He would get the help he clearly needed, and I had a lot to process. As I sat in the back of a ranger's truck, a shock blanket draped around my trembling shoulders, I looked out at the forest. It was beautiful in the soft morning light, peaceful even. But I knew with a profound certainty, I'd never see it the same way again. I'd come to the wilderness seeking solitude and scientific discovery. Instead, I'd found raw terror and, ultimately, a fierce strength I never knew I possessed. The forest had changed me for better or worse. And as we drove away, leaving the trees behind, I knew that someday I'd have to return to face my fears, to reclaim the peace I'd lost. But not today. Today I was going home. Story 10. The moment the strangers emerged from the encroaching darkness, their eyes glinting ominously in the flickering firelight, I knew our cherished family camping trip had taken a terrifying turn. What I didn't realize was how swiftly we'd find ourselves fighting for our very lives in the wilderness we once thought of as a peaceful, idyllic escape. This was supposed to be the perfect getaway. My wife, Ilara, and our 2 children, Leo, 14, and Maya, 10, had been meticulously planning this camping trip for months. We'd discovered a secluded, pristine spot in the vast national forest, miles from the crowded campgrounds and the incessant hum of RVs. Just us, the towering trees, and the boundless canopy of stars. The first 2 days were everything we had hoped for. We hiked winding trails, fished in the nearby, sparkling stream, and spun tales around the crackling campfire, the kids' faces illuminated by the dancing flames. Leo and Maya were thrilled to be away from their screens and video games, joyfully rediscovering the simple, profound pleasures of nature. Ilara and I felt closer than we had in years. The relentless stress of our busy urban lives melting away in the crisp mountain air. On the 3rd night, as we roasted marshmallows, their sticky sweetness mingling with the scent of pine, and played a leisurely game of cards by lantern light, I heard it, a twig snapping sharply in the woods directly behind our tent. At first, I dismissed it, assuming it was just a deer or some other curious nocturnal creature. But then came the unmistakable sound of hushed voices and heavy, deliberate footsteps. "Hello, campers!" A man's voice called out, unnervingly cheerful for the late hour. We all turned as one to see a group of men emerging from the tree line. There were 5 of them, dressed in a mismatched collection of outdoor gear and tattered clothing. The one in front, a tall man with a scraggly, unkempt beard, was grinning widely. But there was something profoundly unsettling about his smile, something that sent a cold shiver down my spine. "Looks like you folks have a nice setup here," he said, his eyes roving slowly over our campsite, lingering for a moment on our children. "Mind if we join you for a bit?" I stood up instinctively, placing myself immediately between the menacing strangers and my family. "I'm sorry, but it's getting late, and we were just about to turn in," I said, striving desperately to keep my voice steady, betraying none of the escalating fear I felt. The man's unsettling grin faltered for a brief moment, a flicker of something dark and dangerous crossing his face. "Now, that's not very neighborly," he said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "We've been walking for hours and we could use a rest. Why don't you introduce us to your lovely family?" Alara had instinctively gathered the children close to her, her arm protectively draped around Maya's shoulders. I could clearly see the fear mirroring my own growing unease in her wide eyes. "Listen," I said, my tone firmer now. "I'm sure there are plenty of good camping spots nearby. We'd really prefer to have our privacy." One of the other men, a burly, menacing figure with a shaved head, stepped forward, his fists clenching. "I don't think you understand," he growled, his voice a low rumble. "We're not asking." My heart began to pound a frantic, deafening rhythm as the terrifying realization finally hit me, the true danger we were in. These weren't just some overly friendly lost campers. They had something else, something far more sinister in mind, and it wasn't good. "Okay," I said, raising my hands in what I hoped was a placating gesture. "Why don't you guys take what you want and we'll be on our way. No trouble." The bearded man laughed, a harsh, guttural sound that echoed chillingly through the clearing. "Oh, we'll take what we want, all right. But you folks aren't going anywhere." In that searing moment, raw survival instinct kicked in. I knew with absolute certainty that we had to get out of there, and fast. I turned to Alara and whispered urgently, "Get the kids to the car. Now." She nodded, her face pale but etched with grim determination, and began to quickly usher Leo and Maya towards our SUV. I tried desperately to keep the men's attention solely on me. "Look, there's no need for this to get ugly," I said, slowly backing up towards the vehicle. "We don't want any trouble." But they were already advancing, spreading out to block our path. The bearded man, with a predatory glint in his eye, pulled out a wicked-looking hunting knife, its blade glinting menacingly in the firelight. "Too late for that," he snarled. What happened next was a blur of frenetic motion and pure terror. I grabbed a burning log, still smoldering from our campfire, and swung it with all my might at the nearest man. He yelped in pain and genuine surprise, stumbling backward. Using that momentary distraction, I spun around and bolted for the car. Alara already had the engine roaring to life, the kids safely inside. I dove into the passenger seat just as she slammed her foot on the accelerator. Gravel sprayed wildly as we peeled out of the campsite, the angry shouts of the men rapidly fading behind us. But our relief was tragically short-lived. As we careened wildly down the narrow, winding dirt road, twin headlights appeared menacingly in the rearview mirror. "They're following us." Maya cried from the back seat, her voice a terrified squeak. Alara gripped the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles white with strain. "Hold on," she said through gritted teeth. The SUV bounced and shuddered violently as we sped down the uneven road, trees whipping past in a dark, indistinct blur. Behind us, the menacing headlights grew chillingly closer. They were rapidly gaining on us. Suddenly, there was a deafening bang, and the car lurched violently to the side. Alara fought desperately to keep control as we skidded dangerously on the loose gravel. "They're shooting at us!" Leo screamed, ducking down low in his seat. My mind raced, frantically trying to recall the route back to the main highway. It was at least 20 miles, maybe more. We'd never make it at this rate. "There's a ranger station a few miles ahead," I shouted to Alara, my voice hoarse. "If we can make it there." She nodded, a grim understanding dawning on her face. It was our only hope. The next few minutes were the most terrifying of my entire life. Alara drove like a woman possessed, taking sharp curves at speeds that had us all clinging on for dear life, our bodies thrown violently against the seats. All the while, the headlights behind us grew closer, and the occasional, chilling crack of gunfire split the night. Just when I thought we couldn't possibly go any faster, the dense trees abruptly opened up to reveal a small clearing. The ranger station loomed ahead, a beacon of desperate hope in the oppressive darkness. Alara slammed on the brakes, the SUV fishtailing wildly as we skidded to a screeching halt directly in front of the building. We all scrambled out, our legs like jelly, running for the door. I pounded on it with all my might. "Help! Please, somebody help us!" The door flew open, revealing a startled-looking ranger. His eyes wide with surprise at our bedraggled state. "What in the world?" he began. "Please," I gasped, my chest heaving. "There are men chasing us. They have guns." The ranger's eyes instantly widened, but to his credit, he reacted with remarkable speed. He ushered us inside, locking the sturdy door securely behind us. "Get down," he ordered, moving swiftly to a radio on the desk. We huddled on the floor, clinging to each other, as the ranger called for urgent backup. Outside, we could clearly hear the screech of tires as our pursuers arrived. What followed was a tense, agonizing standoff. The men tried desperately to break in, but the sturdy door held firm. The ranger, armed with his service weapon, kept them at bay, his voice calm and authoritative as he spoke into the radio. All the while, Alara and I held our children impossibly close, whispering words of comfort we didn't quite believe ourselves. It felt like an eternity, but it was probably only about 20 minutes before we heard the blessed, unmistakable sound of sirens growing louder in the distance. The cavalry had arrived. The aftermath was a blur of flashing lights, intense police interviews, and the comforting warmth of shock blankets. The men were apprehended, and we learned they were wanted for a chilling string of violent robberies across 3 states. They had been hiding out in the national forest, preying on unsuspecting campers like us. As we sat in the back of an ambulance being checked over by paramedics, I looked at my family. Alara's face was streaked with tears, and the kids looked utterly shell-shocked. But we were alive. We had survived. In the days and weeks that followed, we struggled profoundly to process what had happened. The woods, once a place of profound peace and exhilarating adventure for us, now held a darker, more menacing meaning. Nightmares plagued us all, filled with shadowy figures and the terrifying sound of gunshots. But slowly, gradually, we began to heal. We talked openly about our fears, supported each other through the tough moments, and eventually we made a decision that surprised even me. We decided to go camping again. It wasn't easy, the very first time we set up a tent after the incident. Every snapping twig made us jump violently, but we pushed through the fear, fiercely determined not to let those men rob us of something we deeply loved. Now, as I sit by a campfire once more, watching Alara gently teach Maya how to roast the perfect marshmallow, I feel a profound, overwhelming sense of gratitude. We came terrifyingly close to losing everything that night, but we didn't just survive. We reclaimed our love for the wilderness. The forest is still breathtakingly beautiful, still teeming with wonders, but now we appreciate it with open, knowing eyes, acutely aware of both its magical allure and its hidden dangers. We're more careful, more prepared, but we're also stronger, closer as a family than we've ever been. As the stars emerge overhead and the fire crackles softly, I catch Alara's eye across the flames. She smiles, and I see in her face the same complex mix of emotions I feel: lingering fear, yes, but also profound pride, enduring love, and a deep, abiding peace. We made it through the darkness and found our way back to the light. And that, I realize, is the greatest adventure of all. Story 11. The moment I heard them discussing their drop plan, a chilling certainty settled in my gut. I'd stumbled into something far more dangerous than just a group of rough campers. What I didn't realize was how swiftly my peaceful hike would devolve into a desperate fight for survival. I've always been an avid hiker, finding solace in the profound quiet of the woods and the invigorating challenge of conquering new trails. This particular weekend, I decided to explore a lesser-known path deep in the Ozarks. It was a bit more rugged than my usual routes, but the promise of pristine wilderness and spectacular, untouched views was simply too tempting to resist. The first day of my hike was everything I'd hoped for. The trail wound through dense, ancient forests and along high ridge lines that offered breathtaking vistas of the surrounding mountains. Painted in a myriad of greens, the air was crisp and clean, filled with the invigorating scent of pine and wild herbs. As the sun began its slow descent, I found a small, secluded clearing to meticulously set up camp for the night. I was just finishing my dinner of rehydrated hiking fare, a surprisingly tasty chili, when I heard it, voices low and urgent, carrying distinctly on the evening breeze. At first, I was utterly surprised. I hadn't seen another soul all day and was convinced I was miles from the nearest established campsite. But then, a cold dread began to creep in as I realized the voices didn't sound like typical campers. They were low, intense, almost angry. Curiosity, a fatal flaw, got the better of me. I swiftly doused my small fire, plunging my immediate vicinity into near darkness, and crept silently towards the sound, moving as quietly as a shadow through the thick underbrush. As I drew closer, I could clearly make out snippets of their hushed conversation. "The drop is tomorrow night. We can't afford any screw-ups. What if the feds are onto us?" Another voice, calmer, replied, "Relax. Nobody knows about this spot. We'll be in and out before anyone's the wiser." My heart began to pound a furious rhythm in my chest as the horrifying realization dawned. I was overhearing something deeply illicit. These weren't just casual campfire chats. These people were meticulously planning something illegal, something undeniably dangerous. I inched even closer, desperate to get a better look, to piece together more details through a narrow gap in the trees. I could now clearly see a makeshift camp, 3 men. Rough-looking characters who seemed utterly out of place in the serene wilderness. They were huddled intently around a map spread out on a wooden crate, pointing at various locations with grim determination. Suddenly, a twig snapped with an agonizingly loud crack directly under my foot. The sound seemed deafening in the otherwise profound silence of the forest. The men's heads snapped up in unison, their conversation cutting off abruptly. I held my breath, pressing myself flat against a thick tree trunk, praying desperately that they hadn't spotted me. "What was that?" One of them growled, his voice low and menacing. "Probably just an animal." Another replied, but his tone lacked conviction. Then I heard the chilling sound of a gun being cocked. "Check it out," the first man ordered. Panic surged through me, cold and overwhelming. I had to get out of there, fast. As quietly as I could, I began to back away from their camp. But in my blind haste, I wasn't watching where I was stepping. My foot snagged on a gnarled root, and I stumbled, falling backward with a loud crash. "Over there!" one of the men shouted, his voice ringing with discovery. I scrambled to my feet and ran, all thought of stealth completely abandoned. I could hear them crashing wildly through the underbrush behind me, their shouts echoing menacingly through the trees. I ran blindly, branches whipping violently at my face, my lungs burning with searing effort. I had no idea where I was going, only that I needed to put as much distance as humanly possible between myself and those men. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few agonizing minutes, I paused, gasping for breath, my chest heaving. The forest was eerily quiet again. Had I lost them? Just as a fragile sense of relief began to settle over me, I heard a twig snap chillingly close by. I whirled around to see one of the men stepping out from behind a tree, a pistol leveled directly at my chest. Well, he said, a cruel, predatory smile twisting his features. "Looks like we've got ourselves a little spy." My mind raced, desperately searching for any way out of this waking nightmare. "I'm not a spy," I stammered, my voice shaking uncontrollably. "I'm just a hiker. I got lost and heard voices. I thought you might be able to help me." He laughed, a harsh, humorless sound that sent fresh chills down my spine. "Nice try, buddy, but you picked the wrong camp to stumble into." As he spoke, the other 2 men emerged from the trees, effectively boxing me in. One of them was casually carrying a length of rope. "What should we do with him?" the rope carrier asked, his voice flat. The man with the gun considered for a moment, his gaze chillingly blank. "We can't let him go. He's seen too much." My blood ran cold at his words. These men were clearly willing to kill to keep their operation secret. In that agonizing moment of raw fear, something deep inside me snapped. I wasn't gonna die out here. Not like this. Without a conscious thought, driven by a primal surge of desperation, I lunged violently at the gunman, catching him completely off guard. We went down in a tangled mess of limbs, grappling fiercely for control of the weapon. I heard the other men shouting, felt their hands grabbing frantically at me, but I focused every ounce of my energy on keeping that gun pointed away from me, away from Sarah. In the frantic struggle, my fingers, slick with sweat and fear, found the trigger. The gun went off with a deafening crack that reverberated through the quiet forest. For a frozen moment, everything seemed to halt. Then the man beneath me went limp, a dark, spreading stain blooming across his shirt. Taking advantage of the other's momentary shock and confusion, I scrambled frantically to my feet and ran. I could hear them behind me, their shouts now tinged with a raw, guttural rage and grief. I ran like I had never run before, pushing my body to its absolute breaking limits. The forest was a disorienting blur around me. Every frantic step a potential stumble, every shifting shadow a potential hiding place for my enraged pursuers. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning. But eventually, miraculously, I burst out of the tree line onto a gravel road. In the shimmering distance, I could make out faint lights, a ranger station nestled on the very edge of the Ozarks. With a final, desperate burst of energy, I sprinted towards it, my lungs screaming. Behind me, I heard the men emerge from the woods. One of them fired a shot, the bullet whizzing past my ear with a chilling closeness. I reached the station and pounded frantically on the door, screaming for help. A startled ranger opened it, his eyes widening as he took in my wild, disheveled appearance. "Please," I gasped, my chest heaving. "There are men. They're trying to kill me." The ranger swiftly pulled me inside and locked the door, immediately reaching for his radio to call for backup. Through the dusty window, I saw my pursuers melt back into the forest, unwilling to risk a direct confrontation with law enforcement. The next few hours passed in a disorienting blur of police statements and anxious medical checks. I told them everything. About overhearing the men's sinister plans, about the desperate chase through the woods, about the terrible, raw moment when the gun had gone off. The authorities took my story with chilling seriousness. They organized a full search of the area, though I knew the men would be long gone. They found the makeshift camp, along with undeniable evidence of a large-scale drug operation. The man I'd shot was discovered too, his body hastily buried in a shallow, makeshift grave. As I sat in the back of an ambulance, a shock blanket draped around my trembling shoulders, the full, crushing reality of what had transpired began to sink in. I'd ventured into the woods seeking peace and adventure. Instead, I'd found harrowing violence and raw terror. I'd taken a life, even if it was in desperate self-defense. The wilderness, which had always been a sacred place of solace for me, now held a darker, more menacing meaning. Every rustling leaf, every snapping twig brought back the sickening fear of that night. In the weeks that followed, I struggled profoundly to come to terms with my experience. Nightmares plagued my sleep, vivid and terrifying, and I found myself jumping violently at every unexpected sound. The mere thought of returning to the trail filled me with an overwhelming dread. But slowly, painstakingly, with the unwavering help of therapy and the steadfast support of my loved ones, I began to heal. I realized that what had happened to me was a freak, isolated occurrence, not a reflection of the inherent danger of the wilderness itself. 6 months after that fateful hike, I found myself standing at the trailhead once again. My hands were shaking as I adjusted my backpack, but I was fiercely determined. I wouldn't let fear rob me of something I loved so deeply. As I took my first tentative steps back into the forest, I felt a complex mix of anxiety and exhilaration. The woods were as breathtakingly beautiful as ever, the air fresh and invigorating. With each steady step, I felt a little stronger, a little braver. I know now that the wilderness, much like life itself, contains both profound beauty and inherent danger. What happened to me was terrible, yes, but it also showed me how incredibly strong I could be when pushed to my absolute limits. As I hiked deeper into the forest, a profound sense of peace began to slowly wash over me. I was reclaiming this space, transforming it from a place of fear into one of healing and growth. The trail ahead was long and undoubtedly challenging, but I was ready to face it, one step at a time. I was finding my way back to the person I used to be, older now, perhaps a little wiser, but still deeply, irrevocably in love with the wild places of the world. Story 12. The moment I tasted that strange, acrid chemical flavor in my water bottle, a cold, undeniable dread washed over me. I knew with sickening certainty that something was terribly wrong. What I didn't realize was how swiftly my peaceful, solitary camping trip would spiral into a nightmarish fight for survival. I'd always been a creature of solitude, finding far more comfort in the quiet, profound embrace of nature than in the relentless chaos of city life. That deep-seated preference is precisely why I decided to embark on a week-long camping trip deep within the majestic Adirondacks. Just me, my meticulously packed gear, and the boundless, untamed great outdoors. I discovered what felt like a perfect, secret spot miles from any marked trails or official campsites. A true sanctuary where I could utterly disconnect and recharge my weary spirit. The first few days were pure bliss. I spent my time hiking challenging trails, capturing breathtaking photos of the stunning landscape, and simply reveling in the simple, profound pleasure of being completely alone with my thoughts. Each night, I'd return to my secluded campsite, cook a simple, satisfying meal over my portable stove, and drift off to sleep serenaded by the gentle, comforting sounds of the forest. It was on the fourth day that a subtle, unsettling shift occurred. I'd gone for a particularly long hike, pushing myself further than I had on previous days. When I finally returned to my camp, utterly exhausted and parched, I reached for my trusty water bottle and took a long, desperate swig. That's when I noticed it, a faint, acrid, chemical taste that most definitively should not have been there. I spat the water out instantly, my mind racing in a sudden, frantic panic. Had my bottle somehow been contaminated? But as I frantically examined it, a growing horror twisted in my gut. All of my meticulously stored water supplies tasted exactly the same. Someone had tampered with them while I was away. My heart began to pound a furious, deafening rhythm as the terrifying implication fully sank in. I wasn't alone out here. Someone had been in my camp, had deliberately contaminated my precious water. But why? And were they still nearby? I spun, my eyes sweeping frantically across the dense trees surrounding my campsite, suddenly acutely aware of how utterly exposed I was. The forest that had felt so welcoming, so protective just moments before, now seemed to loom menacingly, every elongated shadow potentially hiding a lurking threat. I needed to leave. Now. But as I began to frantically pack up my gear, a sudden dizzying wave of weakness washed over me. Whatever insidious substance had been put into my water was unmistakably beginning to take effect. I stumbled, catching myself roughly on a tree trunk, the world swaying nauseatingly before my eyes. A cold, clammy sweat broke out on my forehead as I fought desperately against the growing weakness in my limbs. With a supreme effort, I managed to shove my absolute essentials into my backpack. I had to get to safety, had to find help before the drug, because surely that's what it was. Incapacitated me completely, as I shouldered my pack, feeling its unfamiliar weight, and took my first unsteady, stumbling steps away from the compromised campsite. I heard it, a twig snapping sharply in the underbrush nearby. I froze, straining my ears against the oppressive silence. There it was again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, deliberately approaching. Panic, cold and sharp, gave me a desperate burst of adrenaline-fueled energy, and I broke into a stumbling, uncoordinated run. I had no idea which direction would lead me to safety, but I knew with a primal certainty that I couldn't stay there. Behind me, I heard a guttural shout, then the distinct sound of pursuit. I crashed wildly through the forest, branches whipping painfully at my face, gnarled roots threatening to trip me at every desperate stride. The insidious effects of whatever I'd ingested were intensifying rapidly. My vision blurred around the edges and my movements felt sluggish, profoundly uncoordinated. But sheer fear, raw and desperate, kept me going, pushing my battered body far beyond its recognized limits. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in a terrifying haze of raw terror and crushing exhaustion. Eventually, I burst through a line of dense trees and found myself teetering precariously at the edge of a steep ravine. Far below, I could hear the powerful rush of a river, a low, constant roar. For a chilling moment, I stood swaying at the very edge, utterly unsure what to do. Then I heard voices behind me, drawing chillingly closer. I was trapped, in a surge of desperate, primal instinct. I began to scramble down the ravine. It was steep and incredibly treacherous, loose rocks skittering away under my feet with every desperate movement. Several times, I nearly lost my footing, saved only by a desperate last-second grab at a protruding root or a jagged rock. Halfway down, my luck finally ran out. My foot slipped on a treacherous patch of loose gravel, and suddenly, I was falling, tumbling violently down the steep slope, a kaleidoscope of trees and sky spinning sickeningly. I hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind from my lungs with brutal force. For a moment, I lay there, dazed and gasping for breath, the world spinning. As I struggled to my feet, my muscles screaming in protest. I heard shouts from above. My pursuers had reached the edge of the ravine. "He's down there," one of them yelled, his face twisted with frustration and anger as he peered down. "Find a way down." Ignoring the searing pain radiating through every part of my body, I staggered towards the river. It was my only chance now. I waded into the icy water, the shock chilling me to the bone, but also, paradoxically, jolting me back to a clearer state of alertness for a fleeting moment. Then, I simply let the powerful current take me, praying desperately that it would carry me to safety. The river was fast and unforgiving, tossing me around like a helpless rag doll. I struggled desperately to keep my head above the churning water, fighting against the drug-induced weakness and the relentless pull of the current. Several times I went completely under, swallowing mouthfuls of frigid water before managing to surface again. Gasping, I have no idea how long I was in that river. It could have been minutes or it could have been hours. All I know is that eventually, miraculously, I found myself washed up on a rocky, unfamiliar shore, coughing violently and shivering uncontrollably. The sky was growing dark once more, and I realized with a start that I had lost an entire day. Hypothermia was beginning to set in, my wet clothes clinging to my body and steadily sapping what little warmth I had left. I desperately needed to find shelter, to get warm and dry, but I was utterly lost, with no idea where I was or which direction might possibly lead me to safety. As I stumbled blindly along the desolate riverbank, I spotted a dark, inviting opening in the rock face nearby, a cave. It wasn't ideal, far from it, but it would provide some precious shelter from the elements and a place to hide. I crawled into the cave, collapsing onto the cold, damp stone floor. Every part of me ached with a deep, pervasive pain, and the residual effects of the drug were still making it incredibly difficult to think clearly. But I knew I couldn't rest for long. My pursuers could still be out there, meticulously searching for me. Using the very last vestiges of my strength, I gathered some dry leaves and brittle branches from just outside the cave entrance and, with trembling hands, managed to coax a small fire into existence. The warmth was absolutely heavenly, and I stripped off my soaking wet clothes, laying them out carefully to dry as I huddled close to the flickering flames, desperately trying to warm up. As I sat there, wrapped in the meager warmth, I tried to piece together what had happened. Who were those men? And why were they after me? Had I somehow stumbled upon something I wasn't supposed to see, or was I simply a random target? Unlucky enough to be in the wrong place at the wrong time? I must have dozed off at some point, because I awoke with a violent start to the distinct sound of voices echoing eerily off the cave walls. For a terrifying, heart-stopping moment, I was convinced my pursuers had finally found me. But as I strained to listen, I realized these voices were different, concerned rather than threatening. "Hello," a man's voice called out, resonating into the cave. "Is someone in there?" I hesitated, fear warring fiercely with a sudden, overwhelming surge of hope. Could this truly be a rescue? Or another cruel trap? "We're with search and rescue," another voice added, clear and authoritative. "We've been looking for a missing hiker. Are you okay?" Relief, so immense it brought tears stinging to my eyes, washed over me. "Here," I croaked, my voice hoarse and raw from disuse. "I'm in here." The next few hours passed in a disorienting blur. The search and rescue team helped me carefully out of the cave, wrapping me in warm, comforting blankets and offering me clean, blessed, safe water. They'd been alerted by a worried friend who'd grown concerned when I didn't check in as planned. As we made our way back to civilization, I recounted my entire harrowing story. They listened with growing concern, radioing ahead to alert the authorities about the dangerous men who had chased me. In the days that followed, as I slowly recovered in a hospital bed, the police investigated my claims. They found my original campsite ransacked and abandoned, but of my elusive pursuers there was no sign. They had vanished, melting back into the vast, unforgiving wilderness. Took me a very long time to truly come to terms with what had happened. The forest, which had always been a sacred place of peace and rejuvenation for me, now held a darker, more menacing association. Nightmares plagued my sleep, vivid and terrifying, filled with shadowy figures and endless, desperate chases through dark, foreboding woods. But slowly, painstakingly, with the passage of time and the invaluable help of therapy, I began to heal. I realized that what had happened to me was a horrifying anomaly, not the norm. The wilderness was still breathtakingly beautiful, still profoundly worthy of exploration and respect. A year after my ordeal, I found myself standing at a trailhead once again, my backpack comfortably on my shoulders. A complex mixture of anxiety and excitement churned in my stomach. I wasn't alone this time. I'd wisely joined a hiking group, not yet ready to venture out completely on my own again. As we set off down the familiar trail, I felt a familiar, comforting sense of peace begin to gently settle over me. The forest was as beautiful as ever, the air fresh and invigorating. Yes, there had been profound danger here once, but there was also boundless life and breathtaking beauty and the enduring promise of new adventures. I knew then that I would never again take my safety for granted in the wilderness. But neither would I allow fear to rob me of something I loved so deeply. The road to recovery was long, undoubtedly, but with each steady step on the trail, I was reclaiming a part of myself I thought I'd lost forever. The forest had tested me, had shown me both its profound beauty and its inherent danger, and I had survived, emerging stronger, wiser, and somehow even more in awe of the wild, untamed places of the world. Story 13. The moment we stumbled upon that abandoned campsite with its shredded tents and scattered, telltale belongings, I knew our fun weekend getaway had taken a dark, perilous turn. What I didn't realize was how swiftly we'd find ourselves fighting for our very lives in the wilderness we'd come solely to enjoy. This was supposed to be the perfect escape, just me and my three closest friends, Leo, Sarah, and Chloe, ditching the city for a long weekend of invigorating hikes, crackling campfires, and breathtaking stargazing. We'd found this spot online, a truly secluded campground nestled deep in the national forest, miles from the usual tourist traps. The promise of true wilderness and profound solitude was simply too tempting to resist. The drive up was filled with unadulterated laughter and vibrant excitement. We belted out old songs, shared an endless array of snacks, and chattered excitedly about all the adventures we wanted to embark on once we reached our destination. As we turned onto the narrow, winding dirt road that led to the campground, the dense forest closing in around us like a green curtain, I felt a thrilling sense of adventure, a feeling I hadn't experienced in years. We arrived in the late afternoon and immediately set about making camp. Leo and I expertly pitched the tents while Sarah and Chloe efficiently gathered firewood. By the time the sun was beginning its slow descent, we had a cozy, inviting little setup, 2 sturdy tents, a crackling, cheerful fire, and the mouth-watering aroma of hot dogs roasting on sticks. That first night was everything we'd hoped for. We sat around the fire, swapping stories and roasting marshmallows, their gooey sweetness a perfect contrast to the crisp air. The stars emerged, more brilliant and numerous than I'd ever seen them, unspoiled by any city lights. As we finally turned in for the night, the only sounds were the gentle rustle of leaves and the distant, haunting hoot of an owl. The next morning, we set out for a day hike, eager to explore the sprawling surrounding area. The trail wound gracefully through towering pines and across clear, babbling streams. We took plenty of leisurely breaks, snapping countless photos and simply reveling in the pure joy of being immersed in nature. It was on our way back to camp that a subtle, unsettling shift occurred. The trail seemed different somehow, though none of us could quite put our finger on why. We chalked it up to our tired legs and the changing afternoon light. But an uneasy feeling had begun to settle deep in the pit of my stomach. That's when we stumbled upon the other campsite. At first glance, it appeared perfectly normal, a couple of tents, a fire pit, various camping gear strewn about. But as we drew closer, a sickening realization dawned. Something was terribly wrong. The tents were savagely slashed open, their contents violently spilled across the ground. Sleeping bags lay in muddy, sodden heaps, and a cooler was overturned, its contents picked over by unseen animals. But worst of all was the palpable sense of violence that hung heavy in the still air. This wasn't just an abandoned camp, something truly horrific had transpired here. "We should go," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible, articulating the chilling thought that gripped all of us. But before we could even react, we heard it, the distant rumble of engines steadily growing closer. "Hide!" Leo hissed, pulling us frantically towards a dense thicket of bushes. We crouched low, barely daring to breathe, as 3 ATVs roared violently into the clearing. 6 men dismounted, all of them carrying weapons, rifles and large, menacing hunting knives. They looked rough, undeniably dangerous, nothing like the typical campers or hikers we'd expect to see out here. "Anything?" One of them called out, gesturing dismissively at the destroyed campsite. Another man shook his head. "Looks like the animals got to it. No sign of the maps. Keep searching." The first man, clearly the leader, ordered. "They couldn't have gotten far, not on foot, and we need those maps back." My heart was pounding so violently I was certain they'd hear it. These men were clearly dangerous, deeply involved in something illicit, and we had just become unwitting, terrifyingly vulnerable witnesses. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few agonizing minutes, we remained frozen in our cramped hiding spot as the men meticulously searched the area. Finally, mercifully, they returned to their ATVs and roared off down the trail. We waited until the sound of their engines had completely faded into the distance before we dared to move. "What the hell was that?" Chloe whispered, her voice trembling uncontrollably. "I don't know," I replied, my own voice shaky, "but we need to get out of here. Now." We set off at a desperate, quick pace, no longer caring about meticulously following the trail. Our sole, overriding thought was to put as much distance as humanly possible between ourselves and those men. But as the sun began its inevitable descent and the forest grew darker, a horrifying realization began to set in. We were lost. In our blind panic to escape, we'd veered off in a direction none of us recognized. The trees all looked disturbingly identical in the fading light, and without the familiar trail to guide us, We had no idea which way led back to our camp. "We can't stay out here," Sarah said, voicing the terrifying thought that gripped us all. "Those men are still out there, and who knows what else. Maybe we should just pick a direction and stick to it," Chloe suggested, her voice thin with fear. But before we could decide, we heard it again. The unmistakable sound of engines, growing chillingly closer. "Run!" Leo yelled, grabbing Chloe's hand and pulling her along, and we took off into the deepening darkness. What followed was the most terrifying night of my life. We crashed blindly through the underbrush, branches whipping painfully at our faces, gnarled roots threatening to trip us at every desperate step. The sound of ATVs seemed to come from every direction, the men's furious shouts echoing menacingly through the trees. At one point, we came to a steep ravine with the chilling sound of pursuit directly behind us. We had no choice but to climb down. It was treacherous in the dark, and more than once I truly thought we'd fall to our deaths. But somehow, miraculously, we made it to the bottom. We splashed across a shallow stream, desperately hoping the water might throw off any attempt to track us. On the other side, we found a small, crude cave formed by a rocky overhang. It wasn't much, but it was the best shelter we'd seen all night. Huddled in the damp, claustrophobic darkness, we tried to catch our breath and desperately figure out what to do next. We were lost. Without food or proper gear, being hunted by armed men for reasons we couldn't even begin to comprehend. It was like something ripped directly from a nightmare. "We need to keep moving," Leo whispered, his voice barely audible. "If we can make it until morning, maybe we can find our way back to the car." But just as we prepared to leave our temporary, precarious shelter, a searing beam of light cut violently through the darkness, flashlights, and voices, getting chillingly closer. "I saw something move over there," a gruff voice called out. "Check that outcropping." We pressed ourselves desperately against the back of the cave, hardly daring to breathe. The powerful beam of a flashlight swept agonizingly across the entrance. So close I felt I could have reached out and touched it. For a heart-stopping moment, I was sure we'd be discovered. But then the light moved on and the menacing voices faded into the distance. We waited, silent and terrified, for what felt like endless hours. Finally, when we were as sure as we possibly could be that the coast was clear, we crept cautiously out of the cave. The rest of the night passed in a blurry haze of raw fear and bone-deep exhaustion. We kept moving, driven by the desperate, primal need to put as much distance as possible between ourselves and our unseen pursuers. Every snapping twig made us jump violently. Every shifting shadow seemed to hide a lurking threat. As the first faint light of dawn began to filter through the trees, we heard something that made our hearts soar with desperate hope, the distant, unmistakable sound of traffic. Somehow in our blind, panicked flight, we'd made it close to a road. With renewed, desperate energy, we pushed on. Finally, we burst through the tree line and saw it, a highway stretching out endlessly before us. I'd never been so profoundly happy to see asphalt in my entire life. We flagged down the very first car we saw, a startled-looking couple who took in our bedraggled appearance, soaking wet, covered in mud and scratches, wild-eyed with panic, with wide-eyed alarm. They drove us to the nearest police station, where we spent the next several grueling hours giving statements and desperately trying to explain our terrifying night in the woods. The authorities took our story with chilling seriousness, organizing an immediate search of the area. In the days that followed, as we tried to process the incomprehensible events that had transpired, we learned bits and pieces from the news. The men we'd encountered were part of a sophisticated drug smuggling operation that had been using the remote wilderness as a distribution point. The maps they were so frantically searching for were actually coded ledgers, meticulously detailing drop points and contacts. It took a very long time for any of us to feel truly normal again. Nightmares plagued our sleep, vivid and terrifying, filled with dark, oppressive forests and the roaring sound of engines. The wilderness, which had once been a sacred place of profound peace and exhilarating adventure, now held a deep, lingering shadow of fear. But slowly, painstakingly, we began to heal. We talked openly about our experience, supported each other through the tough moments, and eventually we made a decision that surprised even me. We decided to go camping again. It wasn't easy. The very first time we set up a tent after the incident, every snapping twig made us jump. But we pushed through the fear, fiercely determined not to let one terrible experience rob us of something we loved so deeply. Now, as I sit by a campfire once more, watching the stars emerge overhead, I feel a profound, overwhelming sense of gratitude. We survived something truly terrifying and emerged stronger for it. The forest is still breathtakingly beautiful, still teeming with wonders. But now we appreciate it with open, knowing eyes, acutely aware of both its magic and its inherent dangers. Our harrowing experience taught us that even in the darkest, most desperate moments, human resilience and the unbreakable bonds of friendship can see us through. And that perhaps is the greatest lesson the wilderness has to offer. Story 14. The moment I woke to find a dark silhouette standing just beyond the flickering glow of my dying campfire, a cold dread seized me. My peaceful solo camping trip, I knew with a sickening certainty, had veered into a deeply sinister realm. What I didn't realize was how swiftly it would spiral into a terrifying, psychological game of cat and mouse in the wilderness I once thought I knew intimately. I'd always been something of a loner, finding far more comfort in the profound quiet of nature than in the relentless chaos of city life. That deep-seated preference is precisely why I decided to embark on a week-long camping trip deep within the majestic Adirondacks. Just me, my meticulously packed gear, and the boundless, untamed great outdoors. I discovered what felt like a perfect, secret spot, miles from any marked trails or official campsites. A true sanctuary where I could utterly disconnect and recharge my weary spirit. The first few days were pure bliss. I spent my time hiking challenging trails, capturing breathtaking photos of the stunning landscape and simply reveling in the simple, profound pleasure of being completely alone with my thoughts. Each night, I'd return to my secluded campsite, cook a simple, satisfying meal over my portable stove, and drift off to sleep serenaded by the gentle, comforting sounds of the forest. It was on the fourth day that a subtle, unsettling shift occurred. I'd gone for a particularly long hike, pushing myself further than I had on previous days. When I finally returned to my camp, utterly exhausted and ready to relax, I noticed something strange. My tent zipper was partially open. I was certain I had meticulously closed it fully before leaving that morning. A chill snaked down my spine as I approached cautiously. Inside, things seemed undisturbed at first glance, but as I looked closer, I realized items had been subtly moved. My sleeping bag was slightly askew, and my backpack wasn't where I'd left it. Someone had been in my tent. I stood there for a moment, heart racing, unsure what to do. Should I pack up and leave? But it was already late afternoon, and I was miles from anywhere. The thought of hiking out in the gathering dark was not appealing. I made a desperate decision. I would stay. But I would sleep with my hunting knife close at hand. That night, every snapping twig and rustling leaf had me on edge. I dozed fitfully, jerking awake at the slightest sound. The next morning, I awoke to find my boots, which I'd left outside the tent, moved several feet away. This was no animal. Someone was deliberately messing with me. I spent the day hiking nearby, partly to clear my head and partly to see if I could spot any signs of another campsite. But the woods seemed empty, save for the usual wildlife. As evening approached, I reluctantly returned to my camp. That's when I saw it. A figure standing just at the edge of the clearing, half hidden by a large tree. My heart leaped into my throat. "Hello," I called out, trying desperately to keep my voice steady. "Is someone there?" No response. The figure didn't move. I took a hesitant step forward, and in that instant, they vanished into the deeper shadows of the forest. I ran to where they had been standing, but there was no sign anyone had been there. No footprints, no disturbed vegetation, nothing. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I sat by my fire, knife gripped firmly in hand, jumping at every sound. As the flames died down to embers, I saw it again. A dark silhouette standing just beyond the fading circle of light, watching me. I stood up quickly, brandishing my knife. "Who's there? What do you want?" Again, no response. But this time, the figure didn't disappear. It just stood there, unnaturally still. In that moment, raw fear gave way to a cold, hard anger. I was tired of being toyed with. I charged forward, determined to confront whoever or whatever was tormenting me. But as I reached the spot where the figure had been, there was nothing. I spun around frantically, searching the oppressive darkness. But I was alone, or so I thought. A twig snapped sharply behind me, and I whirled to see the figure now standing precisely where I had been moments ago, next to my dying fire. How had they moved so quickly and silently? Panic surged through me, overwhelming and suffocating. This was no ordinary person. I ran blindly into the forest, no longer caring about direction or stealth. Branches whipped violently at my face as I crashed through the underbrush, my breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead. Finally, I collapsed against a tree, gasping for air. The forest was silent, save for my pounding heart and heaving breaths. As my eyes adjusted to the profound darkness, a terrifying realization dawned. I had no idea where I was. In my blind panic, I'd left everything behind, my tent, my supplies, even my flashlight. I was lost in the wilderness with nothing but the clothes on my back and my hunting knife. I spent that night huddled at the base of a large tree, shivering uncontrollably in the cool mountain air. Every subtle sound sent a jolt of fear through me, expecting to see that silent figure emerging from the shadows. But nothing came. As dawn broke, I tried desperately to orient myself. The rising sun gave me a general sense of direction, but I had no idea how far I'd run or which way would lead me back to civilization. I picked a direction at random and started walking, hoping to find a trail or a road. Hours passed, the sun climbed higher, beating down mercilessly. Thirst clawed at my throat and hunger gnawed at my stomach. But worse than the physical discomfort was the constant, pervasive fear. Every time I looked over my shoulder, I expected to see that figure standing there, watching silently. It was late afternoon when I heard it, the faint, unmistakable sound of running water. Hope surged through me, giving me a desperate burst of energy, and I quickened my pace. I burst through a line of trees to find a small stream gurgling over smooth rocks. The sight of clean, fresh water was almost enough to make me weep with relief. I fell to my knees, cupping the cool water in my hands and drinking deeply, splashing the refreshing liquid on my face and wounds. As I sat there, trying to decide what to do next, I froze. There, on the opposite bank, stood the figure. Even in broad daylight, I couldn't make out any discernible features. It was as if the shadows clung to it, obscuring any details. We stood there, facing each other across the narrow stream. I gripped my knife tightly, though I knew it would be useless if the figure could move as quickly and silently as it had before. "What do you want from me?" I shouted, my voice hoarse and cracking from thirst and fear. For the first time, the figure moved. It raised an arm pointing downstream. Then, in a blink, it was gone. I stood there for several minutes, unsure what to do. Was this another cruel trick? But I had no better options. Cautiously, I began to follow the stream in the direction the figure had indicated. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, I heard something that made my heart leap with desperate joy, the distant sound of voices, human voices. I quickened my pace, hope lending surprising strength to my tired legs. I burst out of the tree line onto a small, dusty road. A group of hikers stood there, looking startled at my sudden appearance. I must have been quite a sight. Clothes torn, face scratched, wild-eyed with fear and exhaustion. "Are you okay?" one of them asked, taking a hesitant step towards me, concern etched on their face. The story poured out of me in a rush. The tampering with my campsite, the silent, terrifying figure, my panicked flight through the forest. As I spoke, I saw the hikers exchange worried glances. They took me to the nearest ranger station where I repeated my story to increasingly skeptical faces. The rangers organized a search of the area where I'd been camping, but found no evidence of an intruder. My tent and gear were there, undisturbed. There were no unexplained footprints, no sign that anyone else had been in the area. In the end, they chalked it up to an overactive imagination fueled by isolation and possible dehydration. They were kind about it, but I could see they didn't believe me. As I sat in the back of a ranger truck, being driven back to civilization, I couldn't shake the chilling memory of that silent, shadowy figure. Had it all been in my mind? A hallucination brought on by stress and solitude? But then I remembered how it had pointed downstream, leading me to safety. If it was just a figment of my imagination, how could it have guided me out of the wilderness? I never returned to those woods. The experience left me profoundly shaken, questioning what I thought I knew about the world and myself. But it also taught me something important: the wilderness, much like life itself, holds mysteries we may never fully understand. It can be beautiful and terrifying, peaceful and dangerous, often all at once. Now, years later, I still feel drawn to the outdoors, but I no longer seek total solitude. Instead, I've learned to appreciate the delicate balance between isolation and connection, between adventure and safety. And sometimes on dark nights, when the wind whispers through the trees, I remember that silent figure, and I wonder if somewhere in the deep woods it's still out there, watching, waiting. A guardian or a threat? A protector or a predator? Perhaps in the end it's both.